Yo, what's good, Shinobi Nation? Welcome back to Just a Shinobi, the home of the craziest Naruto what ifs. Today, we're diving into part 5 of What If Naruto Has Melody of Fox. Let that sink in. Make sure you stick around, because once this starts, there's no turning back. If you're new here, smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your entire ninja squad. And don't forget to drop your theories in the comments, because your support is what keeps this shinobi grinding. Now let's jump straight into it. Chapter 33. It was hot. No, scratch that. It was boiling. Blistering. Scorching. Hell on fucking earth. There's a town a few miles ahead, Jiraiya offered, noticing the sluggish way the other three shinobi were walking. They'd crossed the border 2 hours ago, and were officially in the Wind Country and on their way to Sunagakure. Tayuya had only been to the Wind Country a few times in her life, the most recent being before the attack on Konoha when she'd helped Orochimaru kill the Kazekage. Luckily, no one living except Orochimaru and Kabuto knew this, so she felt reasonably safe that her cover wouldn't be blown. Still, she didn't remember it being this fucking hot. Her sweat was sweating, and she was pretty sure that was impossible and defied the laws of the known universe. A sudden, gentle breeze hit her from her left. She closed her eyes and smiled, enjoying the brief reprieve from the heat. When the wind didn't stop after a full minute, she finally looked over to see Naruto holding up his palm, a visible swirl of wind floating in it. "What's that?" she asked, moving closer so that she could get some more of the air. "I figured you'd like it. I call it Super Breeze no Jutsu." Tayuya frowned at the terrible name and looked over at him. "That reminds me. Since when did you come up with all of these wind techniques?" "I mostly came up with them by just messing around. They're not that great since I can't really use them for anything useful." "What the fuck were you talking about? This is the most useful jutsu I've ever seen. Make it stronger." Hearing this, Anko moved to Naruto's other side, looping her arm with his. "Hey, send some air this way. Just because she's your girlfriend doesn't mean you should only give her attention." Predictably, both teens noticeably stiffened. They wisely chose not to rise to her goad, and Naruto awkwardly cleared his throat. "Well, I can expand it." He pumped a little more chakra into the technique until it was more like a mini tornado. Both Anko and Tayuya sighed with pleasure, and even Jiraiya slowed down to bask in the breeze. Eventually, they reached a small village. To Tayuya, it was like an oasis in the middle of the desert. There weren't that many people outside since it was practically the middle of the day, and she suspected that they were smart enough to do most of their outside duties early in the morning or late in the evening. They reached the middle of the village, and the redhead raised her eyebrows when they came upon a medium-sized body of water surrounded by a high gate, presumably meant to keep people out of it. Well, shit. It actually was an oasis. There were 3 guards posted around it, each of them reclining comfortably in their guard booths. To the left of the oasis was a small hotel, and Jiraiya began to walk towards it. "I'm going to get us a couple of rooms. You all can explore the town if you want." The teens shrugged and walked towards the nearby shops to see what they could spend their newly earned/pillaged cash on, and Anko slipped off to hit up a dango stand they'd passed a couple of minutes ago. Right across the street from the hotel was a weapons shop, so they figured it was as good of a place as any to start. Sure, it was old and dilapidated, but weapons. They waltzed into the building and took a quick look around. If it was possible, the inside looked even worse than the outside. Nothing was organized, and it looked like a small hurricane had just come and gone. The place could do with a really good dusting and sweeping, too. A gasp caught their attention, and they saw a weathered old man who was obviously not used to new customers staring at them with surprise. "Welcome to a Waka Weapons shop. Are you looking for anything in particular?" "Just browsing, thanks," Tayuya piped, lightening her voice and ignoring Naruto's amused smirk. The man noticeably deflated and went back to his book, instantly pegging them as bored, broken kids. Which they were. Bored, that is, because they weren't kids and they definitely weren't broke. Most of the stuff in the shop wasn't that great if you were a shinobi. In fact, half of the items seemed geared towards weak, talentless civilians who needed them to overcompensate for either their lack of ability or lack of certain physical assets. There were crossbows, maces, spears, and of course swords, but things like kunai and shuriken were shoved into the back corner of the building. They definitely didn't get many ninja here. Hey, Tayuya-chan, check these out, he called, holding up a strange kunai. It looked like 3 kunai glued together into a T-shape, and judging by the layer of dust on it, it hadn't been touched in at least 5 years. As he held the metal weapon in his hand, he couldn't shake the strange familiarity he felt coming from it. Tayuya walked over to where he was standing, grabbing the kunai from his hand and studying it herself. It didn't look all that special. In fact, it looked downright useless and unwieldy. Still, the way Naruto's eyes shone as he studied them made her smirk. Do you want these? She asked, reaching for another one of the weapons. There were 10 of them altogether, and they didn't look like they'd been used much at all. Naruto glanced at the price and frowned. No, they're kinda stupid, you know? A frown of Tayuya's own spread across her face as she saw him look at the price. It was obvious, even if you didn't know Naruto as well as she did, that he wanted them. It was also obvious that he felt bad about wanting to spend that much on them. That's why she decided to make the decision for him. Too bad you're getting them. Tayuya. His words fell on deaf ears as she sped towards the counter, all 10 of the kunai hanging from her fingers. He sighed loudly and followed at a much slower pace. Any Aji-san. What's the story on these knife thingies? She asked, voice sounding disturbingly similar to a child's. The blonde held back a laugh. He knew this act. She'd used it on Uncle Kami. What was his name? Chin? For the life of him, he couldn't remember what that sweaty old banker they'd met over 2 years ago had wanted them to call him. The point was, Tayuya was about to rip this guy off and he wouldn't suspect a thing until they were long gone. The shopkeeper smiled and shook his head, amused by her naivety. These knives are called kunai, and they arrived here right after the war. I don't think they're meant for a young lady like yourself, but do you want to buy one as a souvenir? Actually, I want to buy all of them. They look like cute little teas. Even though Naruto found her act both cute and funny, he still didn't want to spend that much on weapons they might not even use. Tayuya-chan, we can't afford to buy all of those. She motioned for him to follow her outside after shooting the store owner a nervous grin. Once they were outside, Tayuya pulled out a fat wad of cash, waving it in front of Naruto's eyes. Remember this? We can afford those easily. But Tayuya-chan. Shut up, they're yours. Counting the money, she pulled out half of the shop owner's asking price, ignoring Naruto's incredulous stare. What are you doing? That's not nearly enough. Not giving him a chance to respond, she grabbed his arm and led him back inside. We don't have that much on us. Can't you lower the price a little bit? She asked, giving the owner a look Naruto had never seen before. Her long, red hair was pulled back, exposing the smooth, lightly tanned skin of her neck. Well, I guess I can lower it to 20,000 for all of them. Tayuya pouted cutely. That's still too much. These knives are awfully dusty. How long have they been here? They're just taking up space you could use for better weapons instead of these stupid kunai? When the man furrowed his brows in thought, she really turned on the charm. Please? She begged, clasping her hands. She fought down the urge to throw up all over his face. She had to constantly remind herself that this was for Naruto lest she hang herself. The man rubbed his head and sighed. All right, you've broken me down. How does 10,000 sound? Thank you so much. The redhead frowned and pretended to count the bills in her hand, making a show of doing it as slowly and deliberately as possible. Naruto noticed her pull a sleight of hand and remove a few more bills from her hand, discreetly slipping them into the waistband of her shorts. I'm 2,000 yen short, she sighed, dejectedly lowering her shoulders. Standing to her right, Naruto stood with his mouth agape. The guy had given her over a 75% discount, and she was still trying to rip him off? Yup, she had no soul. That's fine. You're close enough, and like you said, these have been here for years since they aren't really effective weapons. I think I've only sold one since they've been here. Making a show of acting excited, she jumped up and down and threw the bills on the countertop, grabbing the kunai in both hands. Thanks, Aji-san. Bye. She yelled to the clerk, quickly leading Naruto out of the store and down the street. As the teens left the store, the man couldn't help but feel as though he'd been robbed. Once they were back in front of the hotel and well out of view of the weapons shop, she held out the kunai to him with a smile. Happy early birthday. Naruto couldn't help it, he grinned. The way her eyes shone with pride made him too happy for words, and he couldn't resist gathering her up in his arms and hugging her. To his surprise, she almost immediately returned it, wrapping her arms around his back. His smile widening into a mischievous one, he picked her up and spun her around, eliciting a loud squeal from her throat. Tayuya pulled back and stared at him in horror, unable to believe the sound that had come out of her mouth. That never happened. What never happened? He smirked. She punched his shoulder, but smiled gratefully. Good answer. Come on, I need ice cream and a cold shower. With that, she led him up the stairs and into the hotel. Spinning the kunai around on his finger, Naruto narrowed his eyes. It was weird. Somehow, the weapon felt familiar. Like it belonged to him. Like it was a part of him. The clerk was right about it not being a very effective weapon, but after tossing it around a bit, he'd learned that it flew about twice as far as a regular kunai, so that was something. With a little practice, he could even say that it was more accurate. Where did you get that? Jiraiya asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. His face showed surprise, a rare thing for him. Naruto turned over onto his stomach and curiously held up the knife. This? Tayuya-chan bought it for me at one of the weapons shops in town. He noticed that the looked like he'd seen a ghost, which was worrying. Do you know what that is? A kunai? The guy said he got them after the war, so they're pretty old. Why? Jiraiya walked over and picked up another one of the kunai, turning it over in his hands. This is the tool that the fourth Hokage used for his famous technique, the Hiraishin no Jutsu. That got Naruto's attention. He instantly sat up on the bed, practically vibrating with excitement. Really? Jiraiya nodded his head, a nostalgic smile appearing on his face. I could never fully figure it out, but he somehow managed to warp space and time itself to teleport from place to place. He'd place a special tag on each one of these things and send them flying into the battlefield. That's why it's shaped so strangely, to get the maximum amount of distance. He paused for a second, studying Naruto with a small smirk. If you'd like, I can show you a few of Minato's old notes. It can be something for you to figure out on the side while you're training. Really? He exclaimed again, only vaguely realizing that he sounded like a broken record. The old man shrugged. Sure, it's not like I'd get much use out of them. If you can manage to figure it out, though, I'd be amazed. Minato was a genius. Thanks, Ero Sennin. The man grinned. Don't ever say I've never done anything to help you. Naruto briefly considered hugging him, but decided that'd be way too weird. What are you guys doing? Tayuya asked, pillow tucked under her arm as she walked into the room. Her long red hair was in a ponytail, and she wore his old favorite black shirt and his old pair of orange shorts that he swore got shorter every time he saw them. Against his will, Naruto's eyes instantly cut to her legs. Luckily, she didn't seem to notice his glance. Jiraiya noticed, though, as he caught Naruto's eye and smirked knowingly. He considered messing with him, but the call of the local brothel was far too strong for him to resist. I have some things to pick up in town. I'll be back sometime after midnight. With that, he walked past Tayuya and out of the door. When he was gone, the redhead cocked her hip and raised an eyebrow. So? Oh, yeah? Ero-sennin said he'd give me some of the fourth Hokage's notes. No shit? She dove onto the bed next to him and rolled onto her back, knees pointed straight up in the air. What's on M? Stuff about the flying thunder god technique, apparently. Her eyes widened. She'd heard Orochimaru bitch about that technique dozens of times over the years. Whoa. Yup. These kunai you bought me are part of it. And to think you tried to turn them down, she teased, poking him in his side with her bare foot. Lucky for me you don't take no for an answer. She flashed him a grin. Never have, never will. By the way, you've gotten a lot better at that haggling thing. You were really, vapid? Flirty? Yeah, I learned it from Anko as espionage training or whatever. It makes me sick most of the time, but I can't deny that it gets results. She grabbed the back of his shirt and pulled him down onto the bed so that he was lying down next to her. More importantly, if you had to choose a flavor of ice cream, what would it be? He didn't really see how that was more important than what they were talking about, so he looked at her funnily. What? Why? Just answer it. He eyed her suspiciously for a few more seconds before answering. I guess vanilla. With rainbow sprinkles. Rainbow sprinkles? Really? Tayuya asked, raising her eyebrows and smirking slightly. Naruto sniffed indignantly. Sprinkles make everything more fun. That's really gay, but I'll let it slide since it's almost your birthday. Speaking of which, what do you want to do for your birthday? We'll be in Suna by then. The blonde shrugged again and yawned widely, grabbing the comforter and pulling it over himself. I want to sleep. Tayuya frowned. She wasn't all that tired and was looking forward to staying up with him a bit longer, but she couldn't exactly say that. Especially not since he already seemed to be 2 steps away from dreamland. Loser. She moved to get up, but Naruto grabbed her wrist to stop her. You can stay here if you want. She stared into his sleepy blue eyes, searching them for answers. It was the first time he'd ever expressed a real desire for her to sleep with him. Up until now, she either made him, or it just sort of happened. She slowly eased herself back down and slid under the covers with him. They'd done it before, but this time it felt much weirder than usual. Night, Tayuya-chan, he mumbled, voice drifting more with each syllable. Yeah, night. She felt uncomfortable at first, but it didn't take her long to relax and squeeze herself closer to him. Their arms just barely touched, but that was all the contact she needed to fall asleep. They spent another 8 hours the next day walking in the heat, but between their new umbrellas and Naruto's wind technique, the trip was much more bearable than it had been the day before. I see it! Naruto yelled, pointing at something off in the distance. Tayuya rolled her eyes. Are you sure it's not just another mirage like the last 50 times you saw something? I'm sure this time. It's not wavering at all. She sighed and didn't bother to look, certain that he was wrong for the 51st time. They walked for another 10 or so minutes, and now even she couldn't miss the large structures they were rapidly closing in on. Well, shit. You were right for once. Naruto stuck his tongue out at her. Told ya. With a clear goal in sight, they sped up their pace until they were nearly jogging, eager to get out of the sun and hopefully wash the sand out of the places it didn't belong in. It only took them 5 more minutes to reach the narrow pathway that led into the village, and it was being guarded by 2 extremely bored-looking Sunanin. State your business, one of the guards said, looking like he wanted nothing more than to take a long dip in the pool. Which made sense since it was every bit of 100 degrees outside. Jiraiya stepped forward and held up a scroll. We're here to deliver a parchment from Waterfall to the Kazekage. Reference number 00A3T6. Naruto and Tayuya exchanged a curious glance, neither of them sure what was going on. This was the first they'd heard about any package. The guard flipped through the papers on his clipboard before nodding. Kazekage-sama's expecting you. Just walk straight until you get to a large, circular building with the kanji 4 wind on it. Can't miss it. Thank you, Jiraiya replied, bowing slightly. They walked through the long, dark tunnel. It was the perfect place to ambush people, and if Gaara was around, he could just shove the walls together and crush them easily. That was assuming they were expecting an attack, though. Whoa, Naruto breathed, staring at the village once they got out. It's huge. Tayuya boredly glanced away. It looked bigger the first time. You've been here before? Shit. Doing her best to shrug nonchalantly, she uncomfortably kept her gaze away from Naruto's face. A few times. Hey, look at that place. Naruto followed her finger, cocking his head at where it led him. What about it? It's just a flower shop. Yeah, but it looked neat. When he raised a skeptical eyebrow, she crossed her arms and sniffed. Fuck off. They walked through the town, Naruto looking around like a kid in a candy store, and the other 3 watching him look around like a kid in a candy store. Eventually, they reached the center of the village. Here we are, Jiraiya announced loudly, drawing Naruto's attention from one of the many food stalls in the area. Name and business? The guard asked, stepping in front of them as they approached. We're to give a package to the Kazekage. Reference number 00A3T6, Jiraiya said, already tired of having to do this. It was slightly annoying not being recognized as one of the legendary Sannin, but that was to be expected since they'd only been talking to guys who were in their late teens and were from a completely different village. The guard raised his eyebrows and checked his list. Why do you need 4 people to deliver one package? It's an extremely sensitive item, and they're here to help guard it. He stared at them for another few seconds before shrugging. The Kazekage is waiting for you. They quickly filed into the building, glad to be out of the heat. They walked up the long staircase and were instantly ushered into the Kazekage's office, only to see Gaara sitting in the large, high-backed chair. It is good to see you again, Naruto. Naruto gaped. His mouth opened and closed multiple times as he struggled to find something to say. Gaara? You're the what? It's been almost 6 months now, but you probably haven't heard about it because you've been traveling for so long. Since the Kazekage was my father and I'm the strongest shinobi in the village, they decided to promote me into his position, Gaara said, the tiniest of smirks on his face despite his deadpan voice. Wait, Gaara is the last Kazekage's son? Tayuya asked, looking between Naruto and Gaara with surprise and a little bit of sheepishness. Well, this is awkward, she mumbled to herself. It'd probably be a bad idea to mention how she'd helped kill his father. Yup, that's definitely a secret she'd be taking to her grave. Here is the information you requested. About the Akatsuki, Jiraiya said, handing over the package. Tayuya glanced over at Jiraiya and then at Naruto. Annoyingly, the blonde didn't look the least bit surprised about what was going on. Apparently he already knew about what was on that scroll, and it made her a little angry that he hadn't bothered to share it with her. Gaara opened it and quickly glanced over the information before looking back up at them and rolling it up again. His face darkened, obviously displeased with what he'd read. I'm sure you're all tired. I'll have someone show you to my home, and we can talk more about this tomorrow after you've all settled in. Jiraiya shook his head. Thank you, but that won't be necessary. It's no problem, you're all staying with me for the duration of your visit. We couldn't impose. I've already arranged a place for us to live. Gaara leveled his gaze on the man. I insist. The room went silent for a few awkward seconds. Well, Jiraiya started slowly, if you don't think it'll be too much trouble. A ghost of a smile appeared on Gaara's face. Great. He pushed a button on his intercom and leaned forward to speak into it. Temari, I need you to escort some guests to our home. Immediately, please. Of course, Kazekage-sama, a female voice answered back. Barely 10 seconds later, Temari strode into the room. Her hair was tied up in its usual 4 ponytails, but she now wore a simple black yukata. A red sash was tied around her waist, and a pair of fingerless black gloves covered her hands. Kazekage-sama, Naruto? Is that you? To all of their surprise, she wrapped him up in a tight hug. She pulled away after a few seconds and roughly rubbed his long blonde hair. You actually grew, huh? You're even taller than me. Good to see you again. Her eyes shifted from Naruto to the redhead standing at his side. Temari stared at Tayuya with confusion, but after a few seconds, it morphed into shock. You! Hey bitch, Tayuya frowned, narrowing her eyes. Getting a grip on herself, the blonde schooled her face into a mask of indifference. Oh, you lived, huh? And you're with Konoha now? Good to see you're a loyal little lapdog. Tayuya bit back a snarl, instead opting to paste on a neutral smile. What can I say? I didn't want to waste my talents on a guy that was going nowhere. But you wouldn't know anything about having talent, would you? Naruto chose that moment to yawn exaggeratedly, stretching his arms high above his head. Boy, I sure am tired. When can we go to your house? Temari, Gaara said, staring at her. Temari frowned, but motioned for them to follow her. She led them down the stairs and out of the back door into a narrow alley, and they walked for a good 5 minutes before they reached a huge house, 2 times as big as the Kazekage Tower. There had to be at least 10 rooms in the thing, probably more if he had to guess. There was a guard posted at the door, and she walked up to him like they were old friends. They'll be staying with us for the next. She paused to look back at them, realizing they'd never told her. How long are you staying? 2 months later, Jiraiya replied. Temari smiled, obviously happy with this arrangement. 2 months. They have unlimited access, but keep an eye on the red one. It might be rabid. Naruto jabbed Tayuya in the side before she could open her mouth and shook his head. She pouted and glanced away from him, sniffing angrily to herself. She'd had a good comeback for that one, too. They were led into a huge foyer, and there were 2 staircases leading to the next floor. It was easily the biggest house Naruto had ever been in. The large windows let in scads of bright light, making the room seem even larger, and a gargantuan chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling. Except for a few expensive-looking pots and wall scrolls, the place was sparsely decorated, but the amount of decoration seemed to suit the open feel of the mansion. "Kankuro! Get down here!" Temari yelled, hands on her hips. The Jounin appeared at the top of the staircase, a screwdriver and one of his many puppets in his arms. "What the hell do you want now, Temari? I told you is that Naruto?" Tossing the puppet aside, he easily hopped down from the second story and walked over to the group. He immediately wrapped him up in a huge bear hug, lifting him off of the ground. "Man, you've gotten big. Still not as tall as me, though," he said, breaking the hug and looping an arm around the blonde's shoulders. "Not as fat either," Naruto mumbled under his breath. "What?" "I said probably not as fast either." Kankuro shrugged. "Don't sweat it, man. Recognizing your shortcomings is the first step to getting better." His arm still around the boy's shoulders, he looked over at Tayuya. "Whoa, who's the babe?" he asked, not even trying to mask his leering. He missed the glare that Naruto was sending his way, too preoccupied with staring at Tayuya's chest. Temari choked out a laugh. "I wouldn't mess with her, Kankuro. There's no telling what kind of diseases she has." "At least I know I don't have bichitis." Tayuya winced on the inside. It definitely wasn't one of her better insults. "Says the gutter-mouthed whore." "I bet you know a whole fucking lot about being a whore, wouldn't you?" Kankuro shook his head, tuning the 2 of them out. "Girls, right? They just met each other, and they're already going at it," he drawled, rolling his eyes and hiking his thumb at the arguing teenagers. "Come on, I'll give you the grand tour. You're gonna love this place." The young men walked up the stairs, both chatting animatedly about weapons and... It wasn't until 5 minutes later that Tayuya stopped arguing long enough to look around the room. "Hey, where'd Naruto go?" Chapter 34. "Itadakimasu!" Naruto yelled, picking up his chopsticks and raising them over the buffet sitting in front of them. He was currently sitting at a huge table, a table large enough to seat at least 20 people, for a family dinner with Gaara and his siblings. Of course, there were only 7 of them in total, so they didn't even take up half of it. There was so much food that he didn't know where to start, and since he didn't recognize a lot of the stuff on the table, he just grabbed the closest thing to him. It was some sort of meat on a stick, but it looked delicious. He raised it to his mouth and took a large bite. "This is awesome." He moved the stick towards Tayuya. "Taste this." She leaned forward and pulled a piece off with her teeth, chewing it thoughtfully. Her face lit up a second later. "Holy shit, that is good." She then held up a piece of some strange-looking bread. "What does this taste like to you?" He leaned over and took it into his mouth, chewing slowly. "It's kind of nutty. I bet it goes great with this meat." He took a bite of the meat and bread together. "Yup. So much better." "I hope you don't catch anything from eating after her," Temari mumbled from across the table, masking her mouth with a cup of tea. Tayuya snapped her head up to look at her and scowled. "I hope he doesn't go blind from looking at your face." "Taya-chan, stop," Anko sighed, rubbing her forehead from Tayuya's right. She had a right to be upset. Tayuya and Temari had been bickering ever since they'd arrived, getting louder and louder with each insult that was exchanged. It seemed like they'd cooled down once Gaara showed up to share a welcome dinner with them, but here they were fighting again. Tayuya openly gaped at the woman. "Are you kidding me? She started it." This time, Jiraiya spoke up from the other side of Anko. "Tayuya, Anko's right. That's enough." The redhead angrily threw her chopsticks down on the plate and crossed her arms, sitting back in her chair. It wasn't fair. Just because they were guests, she was expected to get on her hands and knees and take that bitch's abuse? Sensing her ire, Gaara jumped into the conversation. "Temari, stop fighting with Tayuya. There are guests, and you know better." Temari rolled her eyes and went back to eating, barely acknowledging that she'd even heard him. No one wanted to be reprimanded by their younger brother, but he was still the Kazekage and could easily kill her or kick her out of Suna if he wanted to. He wouldn't, most likely, but that didn't make her feel much safer. The table grew uncomfortably silent after that, with no one willing to look at anyone else. The only sounds were the clatter of silverware against plates, and the obnoxiously loud chewing of Kankuru as he fought to stuff far too much food down his gullet. "Hey, Tayuya-chan," Naruto whispered. When she turned her head to look at him, he held up a mouthful of noodles with his chopsticks. "Here comes the choo-choo train. Choo-choo." She raised her eyebrows at him for a couple of seconds before laughing loudly at his ridiculousness. She eventually opened her mouth, though, and allowed him to feed her. It was strange how he always knew the exact thing to do to make her happy again. They fed each other back and forth a bit, drawing amused stares, and one glare, from everyone else at the table the entire time. It helped to break the ice between the two villages, and soon everyone was talking. Eventually Naruto sighed and pushed his plate away. He and Tayuya had probably put away half of the food by themselves, getting second and third helpings of everything. It was easily one of the best meals they'd had in months, though since they'd been camping out for the majority of that time, it wasn't that much of an accomplishment. "Well, I'm stuffed," he murmured, leaning back in his chair. He lazily turned to look at the boy on his left. "Hey, Gaara, can I talk to you for a sec?" The Kazekage nodded and stood up, drawing the curious stares of everyone else at the table. He followed Naruto to the study down the hall, closing the door behind him. "Is this room secure?" the blonde asked, instinctively checking for any bugs or seals. The redhead furrowed his non-existent eyebrows slightly, finding the sudden change in his friend's demeanor worrisome. "What is this about?" Naruto took a deep breath, letting it out slowly through pursed lips. "I know you've finished reading the scroll Jiraiya gave you by now." "Yes." "I don't know how to ask you this." He paused to gather his thoughts, raising his eyes to meet Gaara's. "How would you feel about stepping down as the Kazekage? Temporarily, of course." The younger boy blinked. "I'd need a very good reason. I don't want to say too much since it's still in its early stages, but I might need your help." "I will need your help." Gaara blinked again. Naruto had never been this serious before, and it was actually a bit alarming. Still, he wasn't making any sense. "I'll need more details than that." "Of course." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small document, and handed it to him. Gaara took a few minutes to read over the scroll, eyes widening by just the smallest amount. "Wow." The blonde nodded, grinning wryly. "That's the reaction I always get. I'm asking you now so that you can think about it while things are still calm, but time's almost up, Gaara. Whatever the Akatsuki is up to can't be good, and whether you join me or not, I'm doing this." Gaara lifted his eyes from the parchment to stare at Naruto, shaking his head. "It's an ambitious idea. Crazy, but ambitious." "It's what I do best," Naruto exclaimed, reverting back to his usual self. "Have you told Tayuya about this, Jiraiya?" he asked, rolling the scroll up again and handing it back to him. Naruto's grin faltered. "Jiraiya's sort of helping me out with it, but I'm not sure if he fully knows what I'm planning. As for Tayuya, not yet. I'm not even sure I want her to know. I may have just met her a few hours ago, but I know she's going to be angry with you when she finds out you've been keeping this from her. I don't care if she gets mad. I just care that she stays alive." His eyes hardened as he spoke, surprising the Kazekage a bit with the intensity of his gaze. Gaara opened his mouth to say something, but he just shook his head instead. "I'll talk it over with a few of my most trusted advisors and give you an answer before you leave. It's a good idea if you can get it off of the ground." "Thanks, Gaara, that's all I can ask for." Smiling widely, he opened the door and led him back to the dinner table. "Fuck, I'm dying out here. Why don't you wave your pretty little fan around and give us some cool air?" Tayuya snapped, fanning herself with her hands. They were currently relaxing under the shade of a makeshift tent after a couple hours of training. They hadn't done much, just some basic calisthenics and light jogging, but combined with the hot morning sun beating down on them from above, it felt like they'd been at it all day. Temari laughed condescendingly, the only one of the three of them not sweating at all. "Aw, the itty-witty baby can't take a little heat? It's just a bit of sunshine. Get over yourself." "Yeah, let's see how cocky you are when you get skin cancer. Though looking at how ugly you are, you might have it on your face already," Tayuya mumbled. A sharp nudge in her side grabbed her attention, and she turned her head to see Naruto looking at her with disapproval. Tayuya-chan, stop it. You've been going at it for the past 2 days. Isn't that enough? Rather than answer him, she angrily flipped him off and looked away. She could feel his eyes boring into the side of her head, but she refused to meet his gaze. Why should she have to stop? Why was everyone blaming her? She didn't ask Temari to drop a fucking tree on her. Yeah, she knew the bitch was just doing her job, but she could at least pretend that she hadn't enjoyed doing it so much. Even an apology would help get rid of some of the anger. After a few seconds of waiting for her to say something, Naruto got up and walked away without so much as a glance in her direction. He wasn't upset with her, but he was definitely annoyed. He couldn't understand why she wouldn't just let it go. Why neither of them would let it go. Do you see what you fucking did? Tayuya seethed, watching him leave. She'd started to get up and follow him, but her pride wouldn't let her. Temari shrugged. It's not my fault he's sick of you. I'm surprised he put up with you this long. At that moment, Tayuya launched herself at Temari, sending them both sprawling to the ground. They wrestled viciously for a few seconds and found themselves relatively evenly matched. Tayuya was normally stronger, sure, but the heat had sapped most of her energy. Temari tried to grab for her fan, but Tayuya kicked it away, sending it skidding 15 feet in front of them. She then jumped on her back and punched her in the jaw from behind, only to be elbowed in the chin by the blonde. It hurt like shit, but she'd be damned if she didn't kick her ass. You fucking bitch, Tayuya spat, grabbing a handful of hair. You need to shut your mouth about shit you don't understand. Temari winced at the pain in her scalp. She grabbed her own hair so that Tayuya couldn't pull it anymore and flipped them both over, throwing the redhead into the ground with herself on top. She elbowed her a few times in the stomach until she felt her hair get released and then hopped to her feet. She kicked Tayuya in the side, eliciting a sharp gasp from her, and then sat down on her stomach. She wrapped her hands around her neck and began to squeeze. Do you know you're fighting the Kazekage's sister? I could kill you right now and no one would say anything. Tayuya lifted her arms and also gripped Temari's neck, trying to force her to pass out before she did. Luckily her grip was much stronger, so when she began to squeeze, Temari's grip instantly lessened as her own airflow was cut off. Half a minute later, both blacked out at nearly the same time. It was a full 15 minutes before Tayuya came. Her head hurt, and her neck would probably be raw for at least another day, but at least she wasn't dead. Her eyes landed on Temari, and she grimaced. Hopefully she wasn't dead either, since it'd be pretty hard to explain how she killed the Kazekage's sister. Naruto's best friend or not, there was no way Gaara would let her off. It might even start a war with Konoha, or at the very least, put a huge dent in their already shaky alliance. She slapped the blonde in the face a few times, grudgingly relieved when she came to. Temari groaned and rubbed at her neck, angrily sitting up to glare at Tayuya. Neither girl really knew what to say, and neither was all that interested in talking to the other. Still, Temari felt an overwhelming curiosity begin to overtake her, so she decided to put aside her anger and break the silence. What's with you two? What do you mean? Tayuya mumbled, instantly knowing what she was talking about. She didn't want to talk to the bitch, but at the same time, she was curious to hear what she had to say. Anko constantly said things about their relationship, but she was Anko. It was practically her job to tease them. Don't act as stupid as you look. I mean that weird love-hate thing you and Naruto do. Her attention successfully grabbed, she threw her hands up in the air, exasperated. Fuck, am I the only one who can't see this magical connection that we apparently have? Temari lifted an eyebrow. I didn't say anything about the connection. I'm just wondering why the hell Naruto's giving a brutish girl like you the time of day. You're way uglier than Sakura, and definitely stupider. The redhead winced. That hit a sore spot. What the hell's your problem with me? Huh? I'm the only one with the grudge here since you almost killed me. She snapped, standing to her feet. The blonde was quiet for a few seconds, staring at the ground to her left. Eventually she turned her gaze on Tayuya, eyes dark and steady. You know what it's like living with a psychopath? Tayuya shot her a deadpan glare, knowing full well that Temari knew about her history with the sound. Of course you do. You're afraid of dying every waking moment. You live every day like it's your last because it very well could be. It's why you don't bother to form any lasting relationships. But do you know what it's like when that psychopath is your little brother, and one of the few people you'd give your life to protect? For the first time since they'd met, Tayuya felt like she understood her. At least a little bit. They were more similar than she thought, which made it a little bit harder to hate her. Still, something didn't make sense. What does that have to do with me and Naruto? Well, Naruto saved Gaara from that. He's not exactly Mr. Personality, but he's a real human being who feels emotions other than anger now. As far as I'm concerned, Naruto is family, and when it comes to my family, I protect them to the best of my ability. Look, I don't trust you. I think you're a selfish, angry, self-serving bitch. I don't know what you're playing at, but I know you're up to something and I want you to leave Naruto out of it. You don't know shit about me. When Temari raised her eyebrows, Tayuya sighed. She couldn't believe she was going to say this. Naruto saved me from that too. I wasn't a complete psycho like Gaara, but I killed people without a second thought. I hated everyone. I couldn't imagine even liking another person. Life before I met him was just I don't know, I just survived and did what I was told. And now? Temari pushed. Tayuya shrugged. I dunno, I live. I actually look forward to waking up every morning and seeing what kind of shit life's going to throw at me next. Congratulations, that's the cheesiest thing I've heard all year. Fuck you. Not in your life. The girls broke down into laughter, for the first time feeling something other than hatred towards each other. It was strange how having only one thing in common could form the beginnings of a friendship. Well, maybe it wasn't exactly friendship, but at least they didn't have murder on the brain anymore. Temari stopped laughing first, shooting the redhead a glare. Oh, by the way, I do have a reason to hold a grudge. You almost killed my boyfriend. Tayuya tilted her head, trying to remember the last person she'd almost killed. Usually, if she wanted someone dead, they were dead. There was never an almost once she decided to end someone. After a few seconds, a sudden look of understanding came across her face. Wait, you and Pineapple Head. Tell anyone and I'll bury you under another forest. I'd like to see you try. She pursed her lips and thought, one question burning at the forefront of her mind. So, have you fucked him yet? A dark-haired teen strode confidently through the dim halls of the compound, eyes focused straight ahead. He ignored the nods and waves of the lower-ranked members and only bothered to return the nods to his true brothers and sisters, the ones who'd grown up with him and knew what he'd been through. The ones who actually deserved his respect. He never understood why his leader insisted on letting outsiders into the organization. They weren't bred for perfection. They thought it was okay to fail and try again the next time, and worst of all, they didn't put the mission first. Most of them didn't have the constitution to fully lay their lives down for the greater good, and as such, they constantly made mistakes. It was baffling. He reached the large double doors that led to his leader's chambers and knocked 3 times in quick succession. 2 loud, slow thumps returned, and using a bit of chakra, he hefted the heavy doors aside and stepped into the room. Danza-sama, the boy said, kneeling in the center of the room. Danza grunted and lowered his head to look at his subordinate from behind his desk. Have you heard from the squad we sent after the Kyuubi? The boy hesitated. No, Danza-sama. I believe that they are deceased. Danza nodded slightly. He'd expected as much. Was there a message sent? No, Danza-sama. The man sneered. That he hadn't expected. They were given specific orders to send a message if they so much as caught a glimpse of the Kyuubi, but apparently, shinobi not trained from the ground up by root found it impossible to follow even the most basic of orders. Incompetence. Shall I send another team? Some of ours this time? There's no point. Kyuubi will be returning soon if Tsunade's timetable is to be believed, so it's more prudent that we move on to the next phase. The boy raised his head, but his face remained blank. I will start preparing immediately. My codename? Danza paused for only a second. Sigh. As you wish, Danza-sama. He stood up and walked out of the room, the doors closing behind him automatically. He'd be lying if he said that he didn't feel even a little bit of excitement about this assignment. Finally, he'd get to try out this whole blending into society thing he heard the others talk about. Danza usually kept him around as his right-hand man, but now, he'd be out in the real world amongst real people, not just studying them in secret. He picked up his pace by an almost unnoticeable amount, eager to get started on the books he'd borrowed on human interaction. The smallest of grins appeared on Danza's face when the boy, now Sai, left. So far, he'd just been watching and testing the QB's skills from afar, using what little info he could gather to piece together a general idea of where Naruto would fit into his organization. It was frustrating that he didn't have an actual report on what had happened, though, since it was possible that Jiraiya had killed them all himself. He certainly had enough skill to. The men he'd sent were Jounin this time, much stronger than the Chunin he'd sent before. If the Nine Tails had managed to kill even one of them by himself at such a young age, he'd be an amazing asset to Root. He couldn't wait until Naruto got back to the village so that he could really get a look at where he was skill-wise. His good eye rolled over the other files sitting on the desk in front of him. Sad Tayuya. Even after 3 years, all he knew about her was her appearance, a few of her most basic skills, and her name. Jiraiya had done a frustratingly good job of keeping them all hidden, but he hadn't expected any less from one of the legendary. They'd only managed to catch a glimpse of them because one of the people in his network saw a blonde male and female redhead going into a hotel near the border of the Lightning Country, which didn't mean all that much since the Lightning Country was well known for its blondes. Still, he decided to take a chance and send some men out anyway. Even if he hadn't gotten as much information as he'd expected, he wasn't worried. Not at all. Things were progressing fairly well as they were now, and once Phase 2 began, he'd easily be able to bring Naruto into Root. Everything hinged upon Sai and Tayuya now. You know who made this puppet? Kankura asked, holding up his favorite puppet, Karasu. Naruto shrugged disinterestedly. I dunno you? I wish I could make something this badass. Nah, it was by a guy named Sasori, the best puppet user to ever exist. As far as I know, anyway. Apparently, Sasori is still alive and is a member of the Akatsuki, and since he's a puppet user, Jiraiya-sama thought it'd be a good idea for you to understand the basics of fighting one of us just in case. Makes sense, Naruto shrugged again, brushing his bangs out of his eyes. He wore a white tank top and a pair of dark pants that Gaara had given him. Suna's clothing was much lighter and cooler than his own, and since their family was royalty, the Kazekage had an abundance of clothing that he hadn't even seen before. Even though Naruto had protested, Gaara insisted on giving nearly a quarter of his closet to the blonde. Clothes he could keep for good. Okay, Lesson 1, puppet users are usually never where they seem to be, Kankuro announced, drawing Naruto's attention again. Naruto cocked his head. What do you mean? Even though it's easy to forget, we're first and foremost long-distance fighters. We pretty much never fight head-to-head unless we absolutely have to. So I should just ignore the puppet and look for the user? He asked, furrowing his eyebrows. Nah, that's the worst thing you can do. You need to fight the puppet while looking for the user. Since you have the Kage Bunshin in your arsenal, this isn't really an issue for you. You can send out 5 or so clones to scour the area while you fight. The easiest way to do this is to look for the chakra strings connected to the puppet and follow them back to their hiding place. Let's try it out. Naruto got into a basic taijutsu stance, watching Kankura closely. As long as he kept his eyes on the Jounin, there was no way he'd be able to pull the old switcheroo on him. Alright, come at me, bro, Kankura grinned. The blonde narrowed his eyes. There was something he wasn't seeing here, but the only way he'd figure out what was up is if he charged in. With that, he sped forward and punched Kankura in the face, only for it to crumble to reveal the extremely creepy face of Karasu. Naruto jumped back in surprise, just barely moving his head enough to avoid the kunai that flew from the puppet's mouth. When did you? Kankura suddenly rose from the ground a dozen feet away, a smug smirk on his face. Yeah, that whole little lecture I gave you? That was my puppet talking. Impossible to tell, isn't it? No kidding. Was that a genjutsu or something? Naruto asked, curious. Sort of, yeah. It's complicated. More importantly, dude, Kankura said, nodding his head towards something behind the blonde. Naruto followed his gaze to see Tayuya lying on her stomach under the shade of a tarp, reading what looked like her family's scrolls. She held her hands up in the air as if she were holding a flute, every now and then mimicking the movements of playing. Like Naruto, a simple tank top adorned her torso, and she too was wearing a piece of Temari's clothing, a ridiculously short miniskirt paired with a pair of her training shorts. She wasn't wearing any shoes, so her bare feet twitched and swung rhythmically in the air in time with her fingers. How are you not hitting that? Kankura whistled, nudging him with his elbow. Staring at her light pink lips pursuing in time to the music in her head, he briefly wondered the same thing. It's not like that. It should be. She likes you, so just go for it. Naruto shook his head, recoiling at the thought. Tayuya-chan? No way. Come on, she's always around you, and you're the only person she doesn't get super bitchy with. That's because we're friends, he mumbled, still staring at her. He wanted to look away, but something about her demanded his full attention. It was both confusing and frustrating. No, we're friends, and I definitely don't want to be around you all the time. Naruto looked unconvinced, so Kankura sighed. Fine, stay friends, I'm not stopping you. Just don't get upset when you see her smooching some other dude. The blonde's face took on a sickly expression. The thought of Tayuya hugging another guy, kissing another guy, giving another guy the bright smile that she only gave to him made him feel physically ill. What the hell was this feeling? It felt similar to what he'd felt when Sakura used to moon over Sasuke, but 100, no, 1,000, times stronger. The more he thought about it, the more his chest ached and his stomach churned. He kept picturing someone else's hands holding her hips, someone else's lips kissing hers, and the worst part of it all was that she was enjoying it. She looked happier than he'd ever seen her with him, and a deep bitterness crept into his heart. How dare she find someone else after all he'd done for her? After he'd helped her to open up, gave her fucking legs back, and basically helped her start her life over again, how could she just abandon him like that? Like he was nothing to her? His anger dissipated almost as soon as it had come, and Naruto shook his head, getting rid of the images that hadn't even happened. That wasn't fair. She didn't owe him anything, and worse, he was being a horrible friend. It didn't matter how she felt about him. Hell, he didn't even understand how he felt about her. When they'd met, he'd basically thrown her into the friend category, so what was different? They were still friends, and always would be. She didn't owe him a thing. You alright, dude? Kankura asked, noticing that Naruto's skin had taken on a slightly ashen color. Maybe we should go inside. The heat might be getting to you. It's not that, I just trailed off, sighing slightly. Nothing. Kankura placed his hand on the genin's shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. If you want my advice, well, I think you should stop hanging out with her so much. It'll do you both some good. You know, give you some time to figure things out. The older boy clapped him on the shoulder one more time and walked off, the puppets slung casually over his shoulder. He didn't know how long he stood there studying the ground after Kankura left his side, but it felt like hours had passed before Tayuya's voice rang in his ears. Hey, Naruto! Tayuya called, noticing that they were done training for the moment. She pushed herself up into a sitting position, tucking her legs beneath her. Do you want to get something to eat in town? I'm starving. His first inclination was to say yes, but he could hear Kankura's voice in his head, urging him to say no. So he did. No thanks, I have some more training to do, he mumbled, glancing away from her. The action wasn't missed by her, but she shrugged it off. It could have meant anything. Oh, okay. Well, do you want to train together until you get hungry? It's something I need a lot of concentration for. This time, Tayuya frowned slightly. She could understand that since she felt the same way whenever she felt like practicing with her flute, but he was acting weird, even for him. For one, he wasn't looking at her when he spoke. She also noticed that everything he said came out quietly, an oddity considering how loud he usually was. Okay, well, okay. See you at dinner. She stared at the side of his face for another few seconds, waiting for an acknowledgement that never came. Something was up, but she didn't know what. Shaking her head, she walked back towards the house, scrolls hanging from her fingertips. A sickening feeling came over him as he watched her go. It felt terrible acting so standoffish towards her. He already missed her company, and he suddenly no longer felt like training. Still, he reasoned that it would hurt more if she moved on while he still felt the way he did. He wasn't sure if he actually wanted to be with her, but he knew that he didn't want her to be with someone else. It was selfish and stupid, no doubt about that. Why the hell did this kind of stuff have to be so hard? Because you're being an idiot, a voice in the back of his mind said. A voice that he knew all too well. Shut up, Naruto mumbled out loud. She's perfect for you. I made sure of it. Naruto frowned. Would you shut up about that? You're not helping anything. The fox snorted but left him alone. For now, at least. There was no doubt in his mind that the bastard would have something else to say within the next couple of hours. 2 hours of boredom later, he was staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling from his bed. He'd asked Gar to give him his own room, and though his friend had raised a non-existent eyebrow at the request, he'd done it anyway, happily, or as happy as Gar can be, giving him the large room directly next to his own. The first thing he noticed about the room was that it was too big for him. The windows were too big. The bed was too big. The silence was too loud. He felt alone, and it was the worst feeling in the world. He knew the feeling would fade eventually, though. It always had. He set to work unpacking his few belongings to take his mind off of Tayuya, but it was a losing battle. Everything he owned reminded him of her, and after 5 minutes or so, he decided that he didn't need to unpack anyway. A knock at the door shook him from his thoughts, and he slowly ambled over from his dresser to open it. "Oh, hey," Naruto said, putting on a small smile as he looked down at the familiar pair of brown eyes. Her face looked angry, but seeing her at all put him in a much better mood. It was depressing the effect she had on him. "What gives? Why did you suddenly want your own room?" she asked, miraculously keeping her temper under control. Naruto shrugged. He hadn't actually thought of a good excuse for the change, so he said the first thing that came to mind. "I needed some privacy. We spend so much time together already, and I figured it'd be more comfortable for both of us this way." "You've never needed privacy before." "Well, I do now," he snapped accidentally. Her face suddenly morphed from anger into sadness. "Did I do something wrong? Is this about Temari? Because we worked it out. We're cool now, I swear." At that moment, he wanted to punch himself. The look on her face made him feel like the biggest asshole in history, and worse, he knew he was only one of 2 people who could put it there, the other being her grandmother. He didn't deserve to be her friend. "It's not your problem. It has to do with the fox." If it was possible, her expression became even more alarming. "What's wrong? Is it hurting you? Should I get Jiraiya?" Naruto sighed inwardly, considering ending the whole charade. It was his problem. He was feeling confused, not hers. He started to apologize, to tell her he'd be back in their room in a few minutes, but then his thoughts flashed back to Musashi and his face hardened. He didn't want to feel the way he did when he saw Musashi press his lips against hers. He couldn't handle it, especially not now when he felt so much more strongly about her than he did before. He blinked at this train of thought, for the first time actually considering what this meant. He liked her. Holy shit, he liked her. He fought to keep a groan from slipping out of his throat. God, out of all the girls in the world, he had to like one who was practically asexual. She told him as much, saying that she found the idea of being together and settling down with someone disgusting. This had been over 2 years ago, but there was a very good chance that her opinions hadn't changed. At least not where he was concerned. She'd never feel anything stronger than friendship for him, so it didn't matter what he felt. It didn't even make sense. She was pushy, had a potty mouth, obvious anger issues, hated kids and anything remotely cute, and worst of all, she'd helped kidnap Sasuke. Shouldn't he hate her? On the other hand, she was extremely loyal, always fun to be around, extremely pretty when she smiled, smart, and cared more about him than anyone else in his life. She always had his back in pretty much anything he did, unless it was extremely stupid, and that was probably the rarest thing on earth to find. It was also why he couldn't bear it if she gave all of that to someone else. "Naruto?" Tayuya asked, stepping forward to study him more closely. Naruto took a step back, and he winced when he saw her face drop slightly. "It's fine, I've got it. Good night." He closed the door in her face before she could say another word. A split second later, he both heard and felt her kick the door and stomp off down the hall. "Sure," blamed the fox. "What did I ever do to you?" The QB rumbled from the dark recesses of his mind. "You flattened half of Konoha and made my childhood a living hell." "Well, besides that." Naruto sighed. He really didn't want to deal with him. Not now. "Why are you being so chatty all of a sudden?" "Because you're ruining the plan. I went through all that effort to lay the groundwork, and you're not following up. Like I've been saying for years now, I fixed her for you. Her hair, her breasts, her ass." "Shut up," he murmured, feeling his neck heat up. He'd just been staring at all of those things a few seconds ago, and grudgingly had to admit that if the QB was telling the truth, he'd done a remarkable job on sculpting all of those things. The fox grumbled for a few seconds but quieted down. He was tired of explaining himself to a human anyway. Such weak, ungrateful little creatures, a lot of them. Temari frowned into the mirror for the fourth time, annoyed that her hair wasn't cooperating with her. No matter what hairstyle she tried, it didn't look right with her new bra. Down, up, in 4 pigtails, nothing fits. Of course, Shikamaru would just shrug and say she looked pretty no matter what, but she wanted to know that it was true without a doubt. Granted, she'd be out of the bra within seconds of him seeing it, and her hair would come undone only a few minutes later, but she rather liked dressing up. It wasn't like she got to do it often on missions or when serving as a diplomat for Suna. A quiet knock on her door broke her out of her mind, and Temari hopped up from her vanity with a sigh, pulling on a t-shirt she'd found lying on the floor. She was expecting to see Kankura or Gaara when she opened the door, but was more than a little surprised to see a lightly sniffling Taiuya looking up at her. She was even more surprised to see that she didn't look angry, but instead sad. Her eyes were moist, and it was obvious that she was trying not to cry, which was extremely odd since she was sure that the redhead didn't even have tear ducts. "Naruto?" she asked, knowing it was probably the only thing that could make her so upset. Taiuya nodded, and Temari motioned for her to come in. Taiuya sat on her bed and placed her hand on her forehead, rubbing at it with her fingers. "I can't figure out what the fuck his problem is. I've thought of everything, and it's not making any sense. The only thing he could be mad about is us fighting, but we already stopped. I told him we stopped." "Are you going to cry?" Temari asked, glancing at the box of tissues on her nightstand and wondering if she should grab it. She wasn't good at this whole girl talk thing since she barely had any girlfriends to begin with. Growing up, most of them were petrified of her little brother, and if they weren't, their parents were. Sure, they all wanted to be friends with her now, but she no longer saw the point. She found most of them vapid and annoying, and frustratingly enough, Taiuya was actually more of a friend to her than any other girl she knew. Not counting Matsuri anyway. Ino was also sort of her friend, though that had only happened when she'd walked in on her and Shikamaru. Well, point was, they actually conversed semi-regularly. Mostly about Shika and their relationship, but also occasionally about girl things like flowers and dresses. Taiuya lifted her head to glare at Temari. "I don't cry. I don't know why he's ignoring me all of a sudden. He moves out of our room without even giving me a good reason, and he barely looks me in the eye when I try to talk to him. He's treating me like I'm not even his goddamn friend anymore, but that can't be true, right?" Temari placed her palm against her face, instantly understanding what was going on. "Damn it, Naruto." "What?" she asked, standing up and grabbing the girl's arm. She released it just as quickly, embarrassed at how eager she sounded. The blonde smirked slightly before answering. "Naruto probably likes you and doesn't know how to deal with it yet." Taiuya blinked a few times, mouth dropping open at the girl's statement. It was a dizzying proposition, to the point where she had to sit down again. She suddenly couldn't catch her breath, and it was a good minute before she spoke. "So you're saying he's treating me like shit because he likes me romantically?" Temari slowly nodded her head. "Pretty much." "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "It is, but so are guys most of the time," Temari shrugged. The redhead sighed, still not ready to believe her. "How do you even know?" "Shikamaru did the same thing. He stopped writing to me for a few months, so I got worried and took a trip to see him. Turns out he'd fallen in love with me but was too afraid to tell me about it, so he decided to push me away instead. Stupid, really? As if I couldn't feel the same way about him." Taiuya gravely shook her head, feeling her anger begin to grow. She was constantly cycling between ire and disbelief, unsure of whether she should be upset or flattered that Naruto was doing this. She always thought she'd be able to tell if he felt something for her. Not that she'd thought much about it since the time he'd kissed her on the cheek a year ago, but he wasn't exactly hard to read most of the time. Then again, ever since he'd gotten back from Kumo, he'd been different. More secretive. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that she didn't know him as well as she thought she did. "Maybe he's just having a bad week," she mumbled, still unable to wrap her head around the whole thing. Taiuya Temari sighed. "I'm only going to say this once. All right?" She waited for the girl to nod before continuing. "Quit dancing around the issue. You're not hideous, so by default, Naruto likes you at least a little bit, even if he just wants to screw you. If you like him, do something about it, even if you just lead him into asking you out. If you don't, just flat out tell him and hope for the best. Worst case, I'm wrong, and you both laugh it off. Naruto's not like most guys. He doesn't really look like that, Tayuya reasoned, even though she knew how stupid her words sounded before she said them. A short bark of laughter slipped out of Temari's throat. He's a teenage guy. Trust me, he's ogled you plenty while you weren't looking. The redhead sighed. So what should I do? She asked, voice small and confused. She absolutely hated how weak he made her feel. Her greatest point of pride used to be her fierce independence, but ever since she met him, it felt like her entire life revolved around the idiot. His happiness was her happiness, and his sadness was her sadness. It pissed her off, but what could she do about it now? Did she even want to do anything? Sensing her confusion, Temari nudged her with her shoulder. Well, like I said, either do something or do nothing. Those are your only real options. So. Oh no, I've already narrowed it down for you and given you a couple of ideas. This is your problem. Well, what do you think I should do? Temari shrugged his shoulders. Personally, I think you two are weirdly cute together, but it's not about me. What do you want? Tayuya leaned back on her hands, face dropping even more. What did she want? She knew she wanted to be strong as shit, and she knew she wanted Orochimaru dead, but what about her personal life? I'm not the relationship type, she mumbled after a little thought. What's the relationship type? She leaned forward and wrung her hands, feeling uncomfortable even thinking about this. You know, wanting the whole marriage with 2.5 kids and a white picket fence shit. I hate kids, I think marriage is a sham, and I can't be all cute and girly like other girls can. It's not me, it'll never be me, and that's what Naruto wants. How do you know what Naruto wants? Did you ask him? She was silent for a minute, realizing that they had never really discussed future plans with him past beat the Akatsuki and get Sasuke back. What was after that? He'd become Hokage most likely, but what would she do? Live the rest of her life as a shinobi of the leaf? Become a traveling musician? What was the point of her life besides helping Naruto? Taking her silence to mean that she was too confused to continue the conversation in any reasonable capacity, Temari spoke again. You'll figure something out. You and Naruto like each other. That's all you really need. She patted her back and stood up. Now get the hell out of my room. I never said I liked Naruto, Tayuya mumbled unconvincingly, also standing. Still, she smiled shortly afterwards. Thanks for your help. Sure. Beat it. Bitch. Whore. Chapter 35. A week passed since their confrontation at his door. If he had to describe his time away from Tayuya, it was basically fucking horrible. Some days he didn't even feel like getting out of bed, and if he did, it was only after Kankuro, Gaara or Jiraiya dragged him out for training. It sounded overdramatic, but it literally felt like his soul was dead. Even his impending birthday wasn't enough to cheer him up. Then again, it had never cheered him up with it being the anniversary of the biggest calamity to ever hit Konoha and all. He never realized what her companionship meant to him before. They really were attached at the hip for most of the day, and it wasn't like he could rely on any of the Sand siblings to fill the void. Gaara was busy all the time, Kankuro's idea of fun, picking up chicks and drinking, wasn't very fun, and Temari seemed to be spending all of her time with Tayuya. Which was weird considering how often they'd been at each other's throats, literally, as he'd found out, since they met. On the bright side, he'd learned a lot about his wind element by training with Baki at Gaara's insistence. Even though he was stoic and a bit cold, the man knew his stuff. He taught him how to make a damn near unblockable blade out of wind, how to use a burst of wind to launch himself dozens of meters in any direction, and how to shoot a powerful ball of air from his mouth. He hadn't yet mastered any of the techniques, but at this point, it was all about practice. Since he and Tayuya were barely speaking, he had all the time in the world to get better, and so did she. He'd spied on her a couple of times when she was busy practicing the earth ninjutsu she'd learned from her family's scrolls, and she was doing some pretty devastating stuff. Stuff he wouldn't want aimed in his direction, and was worried that she'd eventually use him for being so cold towards her lately. He certainly wouldn't blame her. He lay on his back in the sun, amazed at how quickly he'd gotten used to the heat. It was still hot, and he was still sweating like a pig, but it didn't bother him as much as it did when they first arrived in the desert. It was even a little comforting, almost like a warm hug. Not that he'd had all that many hugs in his lifetime. Actually, he could count them all on 2 hands, and most of the recent ones he could remember were from Anko whenever she felt like rubbing her chest up against him. God, she freaked him out. A sudden shadow appeared over him, and he squinted up to see Gaara staring down at him. Hey Gaara, what are you doing here? Don't you have Kazekage duties? It sort of looked like the boy frowned, but it was hard to tell when he wore such a constantly bored and neutral expression. I took the afternoon off. I wanted to spar with you. Naruto pushed himself up into a sitting position, grinning excitedly. A spar? Awesome. We haven't fought since I tried to turn Konoha into a desert. Yeah, since then, the blonde laughed. It always surprised him how funny Gaara was. It was very dry humor, which only seemed appropriate considering his origin and primary skill set. He fully stood up and brushed off his pants. What kind of spar are we talking about here? Taijutsu? Everything. Naruto raised his eyebrows and Gaara's lips twitched upwards. Except for the obvious. The blonde laughed again, stretching his limbs and flexing his muscles to show off a bit. He didn't consider himself narcissistic, but he'd have to be blind not to realize how ripped he was. At the very least, it served as good intimidation for would-be opponents. I dunno, Gaara, I'm pretty strong now. I have some really big attacks. The Kazekage isn't just a title. I have some big attacks of my own. Okay, if you're sure, Naruto shrugged. He pulled out a kunai and flipped it around in his hand. When this hits the ground, we go. Fine with you? Gaara nodded his head and walked a few meters away. Whenever you're ready. Naruto tossed the weapon as hard as he could in the air and watched it fly, a bit worried that he'd put too much strength into the throw. After a few seconds it finally began to descend, and as it did, he began to gather chakra into his body. Not even a millisecond after the weapon hit the ground did a wave of sand rush towards him, but he was ready. Using the new technique he'd learned from Baki, he blasted himself into the air and formed 10 Kage Bunshin to surround him a second before dozens of sand bullets pierced their bodies. He made a final Kage Bunshin to throw him down to the ground faster, flipping himself out of the way of a few sand spikes that came up from the ground. He had to hand it to Gaara. He knew how to keep him on his feet. He barely had enough time to think, let alone attack, but that was about to change. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, he yelled, forming 30 clones. They split up and made a beeline for the Kazekage, moving at full speed. Well, as fast as they could run with their weights on. Naruto knew Gaara's weakness. The sand was only so fast even if it was an automatic defense, and with 30 different fists coming at him from 30 different angles, it'd be easy to take him down unless he decided to wrap himself up in his shell. But that'd be no fun, so he decided to leave the weights on for the time being. He left one clone behind and ran along with the others, mentally coordinating with them to form a plan of attack. It was a neat little trick he'd picked up while in Kumo. Since they were all him and they all had the exact same brain pattern, he found that he could control them to a certain extent if he concentrated hard enough. They could still choose not to listen, of course, but he could plant subtle suggestions without them noticing so that they'd usually do what he said. They got within 2 feet of Gaara, but unfortunately, the sand around the boy suddenly sunk, dropping them all into a pit and closing it over them shortly afterwards. He and a few clones just barely managed to slip out, and when they did, they were right upon him. The original Naruto tried to sweep his feet out from under him, but the legs simply collapsed into sand. Of course, Asuna Bunshin. It was always Asuna Bunshin. He was starting to understand how the people he fought felt whenever he used his shadow clones. On instinct he created another clone to his left, and milliseconds later, it exploded, the momentum from Gaara's unseen attack sending him flying again. Gaara, when he wasn't half possessed by a demon, was much, much harder to fight. He was smarter and more elusive with an arsenal of at least 100 at his disposal instead of the mindless beast he dealt with last time. He found himself wishing that the Ichibi would take over, at least long enough for him to get his bearings. Naruto smirked. Looks like he'd have to be even smarter. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. He yelled in midair, forming a clone next to him. The clone grabbed his leg and swung him back towards Gaara before disappearing in a cloud of smoke. On the other side of the sandy clearing, Gaara frowned. He couldn't hide his disappointment at Naruto's obvious tactics and reliance on the Kage Bunshin. Kankuro had spoken highly of how much Naruto had improved, but he wasn't seeing any of it. Why was Naruto coming at him head-on? Didn't he know that was suicide? Sighing, he raised his hand and sent a huge wave of sand forward to capture the blonde, deciding to end this before he could be disappointed anymore. To his surprise, only around a quarter of his sand moved, and it wasn't until he looked down that he noticed that the sand in his immediate vicinity had been crystallized, most likely by some sort of fire jutsu. Which was odd since, as far as he knew, Naruto didn't know any of those. When did? You really need to keep track of the clones I make, Naruto smirked from behind him. Gaara's sand just barely stopped the blade of wind that had been heading straight for the back of his neck while destroying the clone at the same time. Clever, but it's easy enough to break the sand down again. True. Why don't you try? Gaara narrowed his eyes. Was he bluffing? Or was there a trap? There couldn't be. There was no way. He sent some of his own personal sand into the ground to speed up the process, as he sent sand bullets at Naruto to keep him at bay. "Oh, Gaara!" a voice yelled from behind him. He turned to see another Naruto forming a huge ball of glowing chakra in his hands. It looked like the Rasengan, but 3 times as big. Shit! Otama Rasengan! Naruto yelled, running full speed towards him. Thinking quickly, Gaara covered himself in a dome of sand, layering and hardening it so that it'd be impenetrable. Even a burrowing technique like the Rasengan couldn't get through this. Just as he started to form an eye of sand to look around, he heard the sound of multiple kunai hitting his sand dome from different sides. A second later, he felt himself being blown out of the dome. He winced at the burn on his arm where his sand armor had been blasted away, gripping the wound with his free hand as he flew. Thankfully, Naruto caught him in midair before he could hit the ground. "I win," Naruto said, a wide, foxy grin on his face as he set his friend down. The Kazekage rubbed at his forehead. He had a major headache, and not from Ichibi this time. "How?" Gaara groaned. "That sand you broke down? There was some gunpowder mixed in, so when I set fire to your dome, boom. I can't believe you won." It was a spar and you were holding back." Gaara grabbed Naruto's wrist, pointedly nodding towards the weights he wore. "So were you." Naruto shrugged slightly, a wide grin still on his face. That spar had been just what he needed to take his mind off of his problems with Tayuya. "I'm hungry. Wanna get food? My treat." "No, I lost, I'll pay." The blonde shrugged again. "Well, if you say so." He normally felt slightly guilty whenever anyone his own age offered to buy him food, but with Gaara, he didn't feel bad about it at all. He was the Kazekage, so he was probably loaded. He let his friend lead the way into town. Since he was buying, he was choosing the restaurant. The streets were relatively empty since it was around midday, and personally, he was thankful for it. Crowds didn't usually bother him, but when he was hungry, all he could see was a group of obstacles keeping him from his food. So he was visibly surprised when 2 girls came up to them, both of them smiling shyly. They looked similar in that they both had short brown hair and large green eyes, and the only real difference that Naruto could see was in their height. One stood at around his height, and the other was almost comically short, shorter than even Tayuya, who was even 5 feet tall on a good day. He felt a small smile slip onto his face as he thought about his Spitfire teammate. He constantly forgot that she was so petite since she carried herself as if she were a giant. While he'd grown around 6 inches over the years, she'd grown maybe an inch at best. Vertically, at least. She'd definitely grown a lot in other areas. Kazekage-sama, can we have a picture with you?" the shorter girl asked, nervously biting her lip. Gaara tried to move around her to no avail as she again stepped in front of him to block his path. "We're in a hurry." The girls' faces fell, so Naruto nudged his friend in the side. Amusingly, his sand defense blocked most of the blow, even though his intentions weren't to harm him. "Come on, Gaara, they're your fans. We can put off lunch for a few minutes," he said, ignoring the angry protests from his stomach. Unable to take the pleading stares of both the girls and Naruto, Gaara dropped his shoulders in defeat. "All right." The girls excitedly jumped up and down before thrusting a small camera in Naruto's direction. Naruto started to take the camera from them, but he was stopped by Gaara's hand. If I'm taking a picture, you're going to be in it, too. It's not often you'll get two Kages together, after all. You're a Kage? The taller girl asked. She stepped uncomfortably close to Naruto, narrowing her eyes to scrutinize him. Gaara nodded, shooting his friend a small smirk. He will be. He motioned for a civilian, who looked surprised to see the Kazekage out in training gear and with two girls, no less, to take their picture. The man of course obliged, taking a few snaps of the four teenagers before handing it back to the girls. Thanks so much. We'll treasure this forever. The girls glanced at each other before pouncing on both boys, hugging them tightly. A second later they giggled and ran off. See? That wasn't so bad. One of them squeezed my butt. Yours too, huh? Naruto laughed, and Gaara smirked. He loved having Naruto and Suna with him. New, fun things always seemed to happen whenever he was around, and he was forced to step out of comfort zone on a near-constant basis. If he could, he'd keep him here permanently. Not only would his best friend be around all the time, but Suna's firepower would nearly double. Konoha didn't know how good they had it. They continued on towards the market district until they reached a small, private soba stand. Since Naruto had never tried it before, Gaara took it upon himself to order for the both of them. The cook rushed to get their food, and it was mere minutes before a bowl of strange noodles were placed in front of the teens. Naruto grabbed his chopsticks and raised his hand over the bowl, gulping a little with trepidation. He didn't know why he was so nervous about trying something new, so with a quiet, he dipped the utensils into the soup and shoved a mouthful of noodles into his mouth to find that the dish actually tasted pretty good. It wasn't ramen, not even close, but it was still tasty. He could get used to soba. The boys were just finishing their second bowl of noodles when Gaara decided to speak up. So, Temari tells me you're in love with Tayuya. Naruto choked on his noodles at the sudden statement, and Gaara had to pat him on the back a few times to dislodge them from his esophagus. I'm not. I'm just confused. So you're going to cut her out of your life until you figure it out? That's absurd. The blonde shook his head. You don't get it. I don't want to do it, but it'll be better for the both of us to have some space to think. What do you need to think about? You share a bed, Naruto. Normal friends don't do that. He idly wondered what Gaara would know about normal friends considering his past, but he had to admit that he had a point. He hadn't really questioned it since he figured Tayuya would have said something about it if it was weird, but now that he thought about it, she probably wouldn't know much about normal friendship, either. And maybe that's why she was the best friend he'd ever had. She didn't have many past experiences to affect how she treated him, and vice versa. She was used to being mostly on her own and relying only on herself just like was. Yeah, she'd had the sound 5, but if her stories were to be believed they were more like asshole coworkers than comrades. They worked together to avoid pissing off Orochimaru, nothing more, nothing less. Tayuya fully trusted him, fully believed in him, and he was treating her like shit. He felt like an idiot for even considering listening to Kenkuru's advice, though it had made him realize how much she meant to him, so maybe it had worked after all. If he was being honest with himself, he'd realized it the moment she appeared at his door a week ago. That feeling of happiness and relief he felt at just seeing her face, there was no way that was normal. It was only his stubbornness that had kept them apart for this long, and all it had taken was a few words from Gaara to help him see how stupid he was being. How can I fix this? He mumbled, staring down into his bowl of noodles. Invite her out dancing. Temari, Kankuru and I will go to make it seem like it's just a group outing, but we'll give you your space so that you reconcile, Gaara pushed, sensing his change of heart. Naruto sighed, suddenly not very hungry. It did sound like a good idea, and he did miss her something fierce. Besides, he'd never been dancing before and it seemed like fun. What if she says no? To dance, I mean? She won't. If you tell her we're going on your birthday, she can't refuse you. Naruto gave him an incredulous stare. Do you really think so? Gaara nodded slowly, taking a sip of the iced tea he'd ordered. It was Temari's idea, and she knows people very well. Especially Tayuya. Well, okay. Thanks. You're a good friend. He punched the redhead lightly on the shoulder as he said this, and was once again amused by the small amount of sand that appeared to absorb the blow. On the way home, Naruto was lost in his thoughts. Gaara had insisted that he ask her immediately after their return before he lost his nerve, so he was currently running through ways he could bring it up. They hadn't even exchanged a word since their fight, so it'd be awkward at best and a bloody massacre at worst. He could only hope that she was in a decent enough mood to not rip his head off. Literally. When they made it back to the house, Gaara motioned for him to go up to her room and even followed him halfway up so that he couldn't chicken out. He stopped in front of her room and paused with his hand in midair, suddenly getting cold feet. He started to turn around, but Gaara crossed his arms from the staircase, frowning by the smallest amount. Seeing that he had no way out this time, Naruto sighed and knocked on the door, hoping she wasn't even in there. No such luck. The door opened to reveal a sleepy-looking Tayuya, but when she saw his face, it turned into what looked like a mix between annoyance and nervousness. "What?" she asked, voice coming out less angry than she'd wanted it to. Naruto too was put off by the lack of heat in her tone. He'd been expecting a lot more anger considering how upset she'd been after their last conversation, but she just seemed tired. Lethargic even. I don't want to go dancing tomorrow?" She didn't even try to hide the surprise on her face. "Dancing? Us? At a club or something. Kankura knows a place, so I was thinking it might be fun if all of us went out together." She still looked unsure, and he chose that moment to play the card Gaara had told him to use. Since it's my birthday and all." A small sigh slipped past her lips. He looked so hopeful, and she hadn't done anything fun in days, so why the hell not? "Oh, well, sounds cool." "Great. We're going tomorrow night at 10. Cool. Cool." He stood awkwardly for another second before stiffly turning around and walking down the stairs, trying not to smile as widely as he wanted to. As she closed the door behind him, she felt the corners of her lips twitch upwards. She didn't want to smile or feel happy, but it was like trying to stop herself from swearing. She was still pissed at him, and would be until he apologized and begged for her forgiveness, but she was also glad to see his face. To see his eyes staring into hers. To smell his unique, earthy scent again. Her eyes widened slightly as she realized something important. She didn't have anything to wear. She rushed to talk to Temari, certain that she'd have an outfit for her to borrow. The next day passed by in a blur for Naruto. He vaguely remembered getting a few birthday gifts, and he sort of remembered training with Temari and Baki, but his mind was focused primarily on going clubbing with Tayuya. Unfortunately, his only good outfit was still in her pack since she was convinced he'd ruin it otherwise, and groaning softly, he went to go get it from her. He softly knocked on her door and held his breath. Tayuya opened the door quickly, mouth forming a thin line when she saw who it was. "Yeah? I need my good shirt and pants. They're still in your pack, I think." She scowled up at him, apparently gaining back some of her anger towards him since the last time they talked. "Stay here." He watched her walk over to her bag in the corner, but when she bent over to open it, he was forced to avert his gaze. The last thing he needed was for her to turn around and see him staring at her ass. "Here," she said, practically throwing the items at him. Reacting quickly, Naruto just barely caught the clothing before they hit him in the face. "Thanks." He started to leave, but the feel of her hand on his sleeve stopped him cold. He slowly turned to look down at her, eyebrows raised. She refused to meet his eyes, instead focusing her gaze on his shoulder. "Wait. I baked you a cake." She walked out of the room and jogged down the staircase, ignoring the shocked look on his face as she passed him. "Well? Come on," she said from the foyer, motioning for him to follow her. Naruto, finally snapping out of his surprise-induced daze, did as she asked and descended the stairs. Just as he reached the kitchen, Tayuya pulled a round, 10-inch cake out of the fridge and set it down in front of him on the countertop. It had white frosting with tons of orange and black sprinkles, and suddenly he realized why she'd asked him about his favorite ice cream a couple of weeks ago. "Happy 16th, jackass" was written in perfect cursive on the top of it, and he couldn't help but laugh. That was just like Tayuya, alright. "Happy birthday, jackass," she grinned cutely, looking distinctly proud of herself. He wanted to match her grin, but all he could do was frown. "I don't deserve this." "It's your birthday, of course you do. You can have anything you want on your birthday. That's what Anko says anyway." Before she could react, he hugged her tightly, burying his face in her hair. It didn't matter if she liked him or not. It didn't matter if she decided she wanted to kiss some other guy. She was still the best thing that had ever happened to him, and even if he was destined to just be her friend, so what? Her friendship was the best gift he could ever have. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, voice barely audible. She wrapped her arms around him with confusion, finally returning the hug. She didn't know what he was sorry about exactly. Was he sorry for ignoring her or sorry for possibly liking her? Whichever it was, he seemed sincere about it, so she grudgingly let go of her anger. It was annoying how easily she forgave him, but she couldn't stay mad at Naruto. It was impossible. "It's okay?" He shook his head, gripping her tighter. "It's not okay. I was stupid." "What else is new?" she joked, feeling oddly at ease being in his arms. "But it's really okay. You get a pass on your birthday. I'm still kicking your ass tomorrow, though." She reluctantly pulled away and walked over to the cabinet. She grabbed a knife, 2 forks, and 2 plates, setting them down in front of her. She then cut 2 large pieces for each of them before putting the cake back into the fridge. He took a large bite and sighed, practically rolling his eyes at the taste. "This is awesome," he said. "You like it that much?" He nodded. "This is the first birthday cake I've ever gotten." She smirked and took a bite for herself, a little surprised at how good it was. "Well, it's the first birthday cake I've ever made. Shit, I'm amazing." Naruto lifted his eyes to look into hers. "You are." Tayuya stared back, fork halfway to her open mouth. She felt her face heating up and quickly looked away from him. She wasn't ready to deal with the feeling that was spreading across her chest. Not yet. They ate in silence, the only sounds in the room being their forks scraping against the plates. Even after they finished, they stood there for another few minutes, neither of them knowing what to say or do next. "I'm gonna go take a nap," Tayuya mumbled, grabbing both of their dishes and placing them in the sink. "Yeah, I should do the same. Dancing tonight, right?" "Right." She smiled slightly and nearly ran towards the doorway leading back to the stairs. "Thanks to the cake," he called to her, retreating back. He frowned slightly when she didn't answer, but shrugged it off. He couldn't expect her to forgive him so easily, birthday or not. It was more than enough that she was even willing to speak to him. Waiting for the girls to descend the staircase was one of the most nerve-wracking things he'd ever experienced. He'd barely gotten any sleep while trying to take a nap, his mind racing with possibilities and what he'd say and what he'd do and how he'd do it, and... "Calm down," Gaara said from his right. Naruto blinked. "Huh? Your knee. It's bouncing." He glanced down to see that it was doing more than simply bouncing. It was more like a jackhammer, and he wouldn't be surprised if the floor beneath him suddenly crumbled. "What's taking them so long?" he asked, eyes flickering up to the staircase. Kankuri shrugged. "They're girls. It happens." Right after he said that, the sound of a door opening reached his ears. All 3 boys turned their gazes to the top of the stairs, and all 3 of them widened their eyes. Temari came out first, so Naruto took the chance to take in her appearance. She wore a tight, short, sleeveless dark green dress, and her blonde hair was down and hanging around her shoulders. Her heels were at least 4 or 5 inches, something that did amazing things to her legs, and she clutched a tiny black purse in her hand. All in all, she looked great. And then his eyes slid to Tayuya. She wasn't just beautiful, she was hot. Her long red hair had been straightened so that it fell to just past her shoulder blades, and the short, tiny blue dress she wore clung to every curve. He'd honestly never noticed how amazing her ass was as it curved into her smooth, muscled thighs, and he couldn't stop his eyes from running hungrily up and down her body. She'd taken her weights off, so the skin on her wrists and ankles was slightly lighter. The only makeup she wore was lip gloss and a bit of eyeliner that made her reddish-brown eyes pop more than they usually did, and the effect was amazing. He couldn't look away. Naruto awkwardly cleared his throat and stuck his tongue out to moisten his suddenly dry lips. "Can we leave already?" "It's 10:30, he said, still staring up at Tayuya. He was thankful that she was too busy talking to Temari to notice his gaze, otherwise she might have jumped over the banister and kicked his ass. Kankura jabbed him on the shoulder with his fist to get his attention. "Don't sweat it, bro, the real party doesn't start until midnight anyway." The girls descended the staircase slowly, taking their time so as not to fall on their faces. She was wearing low heels unlike Tamari's 5-inch ones, so it was much easier for her to stride up to him. He got a good whiff of her perfume. It smelled fresh, like strawberries and grass. "You look wow," Naruto mumbled, nervously scratching the back of his head for the first time in weeks. Tayuya scowled while trying to fight back her nervousness. It amused her that her appearance was causing him to regress into his old habits, but it was also extremely embarrassing. "Remember what I said about compliments? That you'd punch me in the nuts if I gave them to you?" "Yup. I'll let it slide for tonight though, since I do look pretty fucking amazing." She threw her fist into the air, doing all kinds of wonderful things to her breasts. "Shower me with your praises." Naruto laughed out loud. Even if she was different on the outside, she was still just as brash and cocky as usual. To be honest, it relieved him. He was just starting to become intimidated by her, and it was a grim reminder that she could have her pick of guys if she wanted them. No one in their right mind would turn her down. They arrived at the club 10 minutes later, and unsurprisingly, there was a line wrapped halfway around the building. Seeing Naruto's worried expression, Kankuro slung an arm over his shoulder and led him to the front of the line. "Don't sweat it, man, you're with us." Just as he'd said, they were instantly allowed to enter amidst the screams of girls yelling Gaara's name and guys whistling in appreciation of Tamari and Tayuya. The club was packed with kids 18 and older, and Naruto couldn't help but feel out of place amidst the young adults. "Am I even allowed to be here?" Naruto yelled over the loud, thumping music. It was taking him a while to adjust to the bright, colorful lights coming from the ceiling, and it was really starting to give him a headache. Kankuro waved his question off with a flick of his hand. "Don't worry about it. Just have fun." With that, the Jounin disappeared into the crowd. He noticed that Tamari and Tayuya had also slunk off somewhere, leaving just him and Gaara alone at the bar. "I didn't think this was your scene," Naruto joked, leaning against the counter next to Gaara. The boy frowned. "It's not." "Why'd you come then?" A strange expression flashed across the redhead's face, though it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "To help you with Tayuya, and to have fun with my precious people." Naruto stared at the shorter boy, amazed that he'd actually admitted it. He really had come a long way from the psychopath he used to be. "Then what are we standing around for? Let's dance." He grabbed Gaara's arm and pulled him into the mass of writhing bodies. He wasn't really sure what he was doing, so he simply decided to copy the way everyone else was moving. He was stiff at first since his body wasn't used to moving in such a strange way, but after a couple of songs, and some sort of alcohol that Kankuro had thrust into his hands before disappearing again, he'd finally gotten the hang of it, especially after finding the similarities between dancing and fighting. It was all about rhythm and timing, something he had in spades after training with the Hachibis. He got some strange looks for dancing with a guy, and the Kazekage, no less, but he didn't care. It was his birthday, and he'd do whatever the hell he wanted. Shockingly, Gaara was keeping up well. His moves were more subdued, but the fact that he was trying at all both impressed and honored him more than words could say. He really did have amazing friends. After a while, it became like second nature to him. He jumped up and down with the rest of the crowd, closing his eyes and letting his long blonde hair fly every which way without a care in the world. His arms and legs seemed to know exactly what to do, and it wasn't until someone tapped him on the shoulder that he slowed down and opened his eyes again. "You're a good dancer," someone yelled into his ear. He turned to see a young, bright-eyed girl looking up at him with a wide smile on her face. She wore an extremely short, light blue dress, and her dark brown hair hung loosely around her shoulders. She expertly twirled and moved her hips to the beat, mesmerizing him with her movements. It was almost like she was a snake charmer, attempting to lure him into her trap. A grin breaking out on his face, Naruto leaned down to answer. "Thanks, you too." Taking that as an invitation, the girl moved from his side to his front, pressing herself closer to him. Naruto froze, and because she was making every effort to rub body against his, he had trouble putting any sort of distance between them. Just as quickly as she'd started, though, she was forced to stop as Tayuya shoved her out of the way and took her place. She didn't look up at him for his reaction, instead just closing her eyes and moving to the music along with him. She was good. Really good. She wasn't doing the same things the other girl was doing, practically trying to have sex with him on the dance floor, but her moves were just as fun and much more energetic. A grin spreading across his face, he leaned down to talk into her ear. How'd you learn to dance like that? Anko. Tayuya shrugged her shoulders at his confused look and smiled. It was a long year without you. Naruto wasn't sure what to do with his hands now that she was so close, so he placed them on her hips. She glanced up at him strangely but didn't move them, instead leaning a little closer to his body. It was odd. He felt something. It was an animalistic feeling, and the more they danced, the more powerful it became. The bass boomed powerfully throughout their bodies, and it wasn't long before he forgot he was surrounded by dozens of other people. In his mind, they were alone. All too soon, the song stopped. As people began to clap for them, Tayuya pushed herself away from him. He wasn't sure if it was the light, but her eyes seemed to be glowing. Just as quickly, they returned to normal, leaving him wondering if he'd even seen it at all. Before he could ask her if she was alright, Kankuro appeared out of nowhere, Gaara being pulled along with him. Instantly, loud shouts of Kazakage-sama began to appear from the crowd. You guys were amazing! There's no way this is your first time at a club! Kankuro exclaimed, looping around both of their shoulders. I guess we're just naturals, right, Tayuya-chan? She just stared at him with a frustratingly blank look, but after a few seconds she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Yeah, right. I need a drink. She pushed her way through the crowd, ignoring the advances of the guys and girls who'd seen her dance. Give me water, she told the bartender, slipping herself onto one of the stools. The young man, who didn't even try to hide his leering, gave her what she wanted. Luckily for him, her mind was miles away, or else she might have shoved the glass down his throat. That was some performance, Tamari said, taking the stool next to her. She held up a finger and the bartender placed what looked like a glass of beer in front of her, shooting her a wink as he did so. Unsurprisingly, the blonde ignored the gesture in favor of badgering Tayuya. Does that mean you decided what to do about Naruto? I'm just here to dance and have fun, nothing more, nothing less. Tamari shook her head. Wow. What? I didn't know you were such a coward is all. I am not a fucking coward, Tayuya seethed. The blonde pushed her drink in front of Tayuya. Prove it. Drink this. She grabbed the glass and took a big gulp without a moment's hesitation, only to instantly cough and sputter as the liquid burned her throat. That's not beer. Tamari laughed at the pained expression on her face and easily downed the rest of the beverage. I never said it was. At that moment, a dark-haired guy strode up to the two of them, inserting himself into the conversation. Do either of you ladies want to dance? Both girls looked at him over. He didn't seem as disgusting as most of the guys that had been bugging them all night, and he was attractive enough, so the blonde shrugged. Fine, Tamari sighed, taking the man's hand as if she were doing him the greatest favor in the world. But touch anything and my brothers will know. The man noticeably paled, suddenly realizing who she was. Tayuya laughed at the poor sap. He didn't know what he'd gotten himself into. On the other side of the room, the guys were having a similar conversation. She wants you, man. Don't you think she wants him, Gaara? Kankuro exclaimed, waving his beer around. Gaara dipped his head slightly in a half nod. She was not adverse to you touching her. Right. Even he can see it. Naruto sighed. This was the third time in 10 minutes that Kankuro had brought this up, and it was really starting to get on his nerves. It was just dancing. Dude, do you even have a penis? Okay, fine, if you're not gonna go for Tayuya, hook up with her, he said, pointing his beer at the girl that had been dancing with him before Tayuya intervened. She's definitely into you. Look, she's licking her lips and doing the hair flip and everything. Plus you're not even from around here, so you don't have to worry about her trying to dig her claws into you later. I don't want to hook up with anyone, Naruto snapped. Which was the truth. He could objectively say that the girl was attractive, but she wasn't beautiful. She wasn't hot. She couldn't make his heart jump with only a grin or glance. Kankuro smirked. Unless it's Tayuya, right? The blonde threw his hands up in the air. Why do you want me together with her so much? I don't really care who you're with, I just want you to not be such a loser. You're Gaara's best friend, so you're my little brother now. We're family. And let's face it, bro, you need to get laid. Even though he tried to fight it, Naruto couldn't stop a small smile from appearing on his face. The fact that Kankura considered him family made him a lot happier than it should have. It was the first time anyone had ever said something like that to him, even if he was not so subtly calling him a loser. I just turned 16. So? I lost my virginity at 14. To a cow, Gaara mumbled into his drink, causing Naruto to laugh. Says virgin number 2. I'd rather wait for someone that doesn't moo. Kankura frowned, obviously not pleased with the direction the conversation had gone. Whatever, I'm getting some tonight. Watch the master. He handed Naruto his drink and made a beeline for the dark-haired girl that had tried to dance with him earlier. She looked over at Naruto and pouted but grabbed Kankura's arm anyway, walking with him to the dance floor. I think it's admirable that you want to save yourself for someone you love, Gaara said after his brother was out of sight. Naruto smiled. Thanks, Gaara. But you're stupid for not considering Tayuya to be that someone. I take my thanks back. Naruto drained Kankura's bottle. He didn't like beer very much since it took far too much of it to get him drunk and it tasted terrible, but he was thirsty, and it was free. Come on, let's dance some more. Tayuya slumped in her seat at the bar, nursing a drink she'd ordered over 10 minutes ago. She'd danced with Temari, Kankura, Gaara, and Naruto for almost 3 straight hours, and she was exhausted. Without a doubt her feet would be sore tomorrow, and she was grateful that she hadn't worn the 4-inch heels Temari had tried to force on her. She might have had to amputate her feet otherwise. Fancy a dance? I couldn't help but notice your bright, red hair from across the room, a smooth voice said, catching her attention. Tayuya groaned and turned to look at him. Besides the fact that she was far too tired to even think about doing any more dancing, the guy was skinny, dumb-looking, and had possibly the sleaziest smile she'd ever seen on a person that wasn't Orochimaru. In other words, the complete opposite of her type. Fuck off, dickless wonder. Of course, he didn't catch the hint. They never did. I see your hair matches your personality. I like that. Can I buy you a drink? She was just about to slam her fist into his nose when Naruto appeared from her left. He was smiling, but she could easily see the hostility in his eyes as he stared at the stranger. Somehow, it made her heart flutter a little. Hey, sorry, she's with me, the genin said, struggling to keep up his grin. Apparently not believing him, the man narrowed his eyes suspiciously. Yeah? What's her name? Tayuya scowled. My name is Leave before I shove my heel up your ass, faggot. He looked surprised and angered by her language, but it made him walk away, shooting them both dirty looks as he disappeared into the crowd. Ouch, did you have to be so mean? Naruto joked, reaching over and taking a swig from her drink. It's been happening all night. I'm just sick of it. She noticed him frown at this, an unreadable expression passing across his face. He drained the rest of her glass and slammed it down on the bar. Wanna get some air then? The relief that poured into her face instantly gave him her answer, so he grabbed her hand and led her through the crowd towards the door. It always weirds me out how cold it gets at night in the desert, Tayuya said, rubbing her bare upper arms once they stepped outside. It was cold enough for her to see her breath, and the light sheen of sweat on her skin meant that she was only going to get colder. She almost gasped when Naruto wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she snapped her head up to look at him, alarm evident in her features. What are you doing? I don't have a jacket, and you're cold, so. As much as she wanted to push him away, she really did feel a lot warmer. She didn't know what it was about him, but his body was practically a furnace. She almost wanted to say that it was because of the QB sealed in his stomach. Oh. Thanks. Her mind struggled for something else to say, and it wasn't until she glanced down at the arms encircling her that she thought of something amusing. Did I tell you how great you look tonight? Naruto raised an eyebrow but grinned. Nope. Well, you look pretty hot. Like a side of beef. His grin widened. Coming from the hottest girl in the club, that means a lot. They shared a laugh at their exchange, both finding the whole thing ridiculous. It also helped to dissipate any awkwardness that came with the compliments. If they took each other seriously, well, neither was quite ready to think about that possibility. As she stood there in the cool, night air wrapped in his arms, she felt herself becoming hyper-aware of everything around her. The loud, thumping music inside, the fog made by their warm breath, and especially the knowing smirks and stares of the people surrounding them. After she thought about it some more, she realized that they probably looked like a couple, and strangely, that thought didn't bother her in the slightest. Why would it? He made her laugh. He made her angry. He made her sad. He made her happy. He made her feel more than she ever had until she met him. And that was it. At that moment, she realized it. That feeling that had been there since their first conversation in the hospital, and the feeling that she thought was impossible for someone like her to have. She maybe, kind of, sort of, loved him. She hadn't thought much about love since she was a child and drooling over Misumi, but she always thought she'd realize it in this huge romantic moment where the guy would hand her flowers and chocolates, and then whisk her away on a white stallion, not while he was holding her in front of a noisy club. Her legs felt weaker beneath her, and suddenly she found herself leaning more heavily on Naruto just to hold herself up. Temari's words from the week before echoed in her head, telling her what to do even though she'd made up her mind the second she came to terms with feelings. She turned around in his arms until she was facing him, tilting her head back to look up at him. She was sure her face was the color of a tomato, but it didn't matter. Not right now. Naruto. Naruto curiously cocked his head, eyes bright even in the darkness. Yeah? Tayuya leaned up on her toes, grabbed the front of his shirt, and pressed her lips against his. She kissed him for a full 10 seconds, closing her eyes so that she wouldn't have to see his expression just yet. She eventually broke away and stood back, smiling awkwardly at his wide eyes and slightly open mouth. Happy birthday. Chapter 36. Tayuya smiled softly to herself as she spooned some soup into her bowl. She didn't know why, but she'd gotten up extra early to make breakfast. It had taken her the better part of an hour to whip everything up, though most of the time she wasn't really all there. Instead, she'd found her mind constantly drifting to the night before where she'd either fucked up or strengthened her relationship with Naruto. She'd kissed him. Uzumaki Naruto. She'd grabbed him by the shirt and slammed her lips against his without even asking his permission. God, he was probably repulsed by her now. Or maybe he'd liked it. Perhaps he didn't even know how to feel about it, since she sure as hell didn't. Fuck, what if he still loved Sakura and was upset with her? She angrily slammed the spoon back into the pot as she found her mind once again spiraling downwards. Oh right, that's why she'd gotten up early and made enough food to feed 10 people. Of course, she'd done all of this after staring at Naruto's sleeping face for a good 5 minutes. Not intentionally, but it was hard not to wake up in the same bed with someone and not spend some time wondering how you got there after the life-altering event they just shared. She'd been still wearing her blue dress, that had ridden up until just above mid-thigh, and he was only wearing his pants. Apparently, he'd thrown his shirt off at some point during the night. Either that or they'd had a drunken makeout session, which wouldn't have made much sense given that neither of them had been drunk, and she'd definitely remember something like that. Even if the chances that that had happened were slim, the thought still brought a tiny smile to her face. She sat down at the small table in the kitchen and began to eat, eyes lighting up at how good it tasted. For someone who'd just started cooking a couple of years ago, she was amazing at it. She never thought she'd ever cook for anyone else, let alone herself, but here she was. Maybe Naruto would see that as a selling point, and could overlook the fact that she was occasionally rude and a little violent. You're in a good mood, Anko mumbled, tired and bleary-eyed as she shuffled into the kitchen. Tayuya glanced up from her soup, eyebrows arching slightly. Huh? No, I'm not. The Jounin shot her a deadpan frown. You were just humming. You don't hum. The redhead averted her gaze, feeling a little uncomfortable under Anko's scrutinizing gaze. She actually hadn't even noticed she was doing it. I hum sometimes. I've spent almost every day with you for the past 2.5 years. You don't hum. Something good happened last night? She asked, wiggling her eyebrows as she suggestively picked up a banana from the fruit bowl. Luckily, Naruto walked into the kitchen, saving her from more invasive questions. His face flushed as soon as his eyes landed on his teammates, and it was all he could do not to look away. Hey, Tayuya-chan, he mumbled, unable to stop the slight waver in his voice as he spoke. Tayuya felt her heart jump into her throat at his voice. It was the first thing he'd said to her since she'd kissed him, and she found that she couldn't even begin to read his expression. Was he upset? Happy? What the hell was he thinking in that big, stupid blonde head of his? Hey yourself. She was oddly proud of how strongly her voice had come out considering how unsure she felt at the moment. Enko looked from Naruto to Tayuya and back again. They both had an equally sheepish look on their faces, and it was then that the woman realized what was up. No, she gasped, the banana that had been in her hand falling onto the countertop. You know what? I'm out of here. I'm too tired to even begin to deal with this. He waited a minute or so after Enko walked out of the kitchen before speaking. So, Naruto started, digging his fingernails into the orange he'd grabbed from the fruit bowl. He didn't really know how to ask, but he had to know. Right after they'd kissed, a drunk Kankura had stumbled out of the club with Temari, Gaara, and 2 other girls in tow. He'd been too busy trying to keep Kankura from falling over himself to really ask Tayuya why she'd kissed him, and she'd been too busy trying to keep one of the girls' hands off of Naruto, the same girl who tried dry humping him earlier, to ask how he felt about it. In the end, they'd fallen into bed exhausted without saying another word to each other. At least that's how he remembered the rest of the night going. So, he started again, taking a deep breath. Why'd you kiss me? Tayuya shrugged her shoulders. She had to admit that she was a little put off by his straightforwardness. She expected a lot more hemming and hawking before he got around to asking her. I dunno. I felt like it. Oh. He nervously tossed the orange from hand to hand. So, like, what did you mean by it? She shrugged again, still not quite meeting his eyes. What do you want it to mean? I dunno. He raised his head to look at her, taking a deep breath. Look, Tayuya-chan, I saw her face crumble slightly even though she tried to hide it. He knew he should come clean about everything before things got too serious, but he couldn't bear to see her upset. Not after they'd just reconciled. Hey, what smells good? Kankura yawned, scratching his bare stomach as he stumbled into the kitchen. Luckily his eyes were still closed, so he missed Naruto suddenly dropping his orange and Tayuya picking up her spoon and becoming a little too interested in her food. Oh, Tayuya-chan made breakfast, Naruto stuttered, neck turning a light red. Really? Sweet. He poured himself a bowl of her soup and took a sip, nodding appreciatively at the taste. So, dude, those girls I took home? Fucking crazy. I could barely feel my legs when I woke up this morning, and then we did it again. I'd offer you a piece of them, but I already kicked them out. He took another long swallow from his bowl and sighed. So, are we training or what? You might actually win today with me being exhausted and all. Naruto glanced over at Tayuya to see that she was quite content to just slowly sip her miso soup and not look at him, so he grinned and nodded. Yup. Just let me get dressed. He turned on his heel and exited the kitchen, shooting one last, helpless glance at his teammate. As soon as the blonde was out of sight, Kankura turned his eyes on the redhead. What about you? Are you training with Temari? His eyebrows furrowed slightly as he noticed the pink hue of her skin. What's with your face? Are you sick from last night? Tayuya shook her head a little too quickly. No, I just, this heat. You know. The Jounin nodded in understanding. Yeah, it takes a while to get used to. Try sucking on ice cubes, it helps. Thanks. I'll do that. Kankura raised his eyebrows. I don't know you very well, but you don't seem like the thanking type. Are you sure you're alright? Would you just fuck off already? There's the Tayuya I think I sorta know and love. Her glare deepened, so he wisely took his bowl of soup and left the kitchen, leaving the girl alone to her own thoughts. Tayuya read over the scroll for what felt like the millionth time that day. It was late afternoon, and she'd been trying since morning to get the stupid technique down. The most annoying part was that it really wasn't that hard. All she was doing was making a fucking mountain, which really should have been cake for her. Her chakra reserves were plenty large enough to do it, and she'd performed similar techniques dozens of times over the years. Hell, she had almost as much chakra as she did while using the Stage 1 curse seal. It had initially bothered her that she'd become so powerful shortly after receiving the Sozo Seize, but after a few months, she'd learned to accept it. And why shouldn't she? Just because Orochimaru's power boost came with a shitload of drawbacks didn't mean the Sozo Seize did, too. Besides the whole dying a few years earlier thing, which really didn't matter considering her profession had such a high mortality rate to begin with, she hadn't noticed any other adverse effects. Tayuya shook her head, realizing that she was getting lost in her thoughts again instead of focusing on her technique. At least she wasn't thinking about Naruto and that stupid kiss this time. She ran through the seals at a slower pace to make sure that she was doing them right and slammed her hands into the ground. Ninpu Earth Jutsu. Instead of the mountain she was expecting, a pathetic handful of dirt sprung up from the ground. Frustrated, she slammed her fist into the tiny mound of sand and swore loudly. A shadow passed over her a few seconds later, and she could immediately tell by the shadow's 4 ponytails who it was. I'm pretty sure that's not how you perform that jutsu, a light, amused voice said from behind her. Tayuya rolled her eyes. Golly gee whizzers, that's sure nice of you to point out. Oh hey, did you also notice that I was flipping you off? Your mind's not clear. You're thinking too hard about something else and not molding your chakra correctly, Temari said, sitting down next to her and squinting at the scroll. Yeah? What tipped you off? She grumbled. Temari sighed. She knew that Tayuya was trying to goad her into a fight to shift the attention off of herself, but it wasn't going to work this time. So, you're gonna tell me what's up with you and Naruto? The way Tayuya winced confirmed Temari's suspicion that she was trying to distract her. There's nothing up with us. The blonde leveled her with a deadpan stare. I just finished watching Kankura kick Naruto's ass around the training grounds with a puppet for the past hour. There's obviously something going on. Tayuya huffed. Temari was really starting to annoy her, and it wasn't like her to dance around an issue anyway, so she decided to just say it. I kissed him. What kind of kiss? How long? Any tongue? Did he grab your ass? The blonde asked, eyes shining as she leaned forward. The genin sat back, uncomfortable with both the questions and the raping of her personal space. I don't know, a regular kiss. It doesn't matter since he hasn't even said if he liked it or not. Temari was quiet for a good few minutes, face screwing up in thought. Every now and then she'd tilt her head to one side, and subconsciously, Tayuya found herself mirroring the blonde's actions. After a while, Tayuya couldn't take it anymore. What? I was trying to decide who should make the first move. What are you talking about? I already did. No, I mean she lifted her hands, made a hole with one of them, and pushed the pointer finger of her other hand into it. Tayuya's face instantly flushed, and her mouth dropped open in horror. Gross. Temari smirked. Is it? The redhead jumped to her feet, apparently tired of talking. I'm gonna shower your skeeziness off. I don't know why I even bothered telling you. Laughing, Temari grabbed Tayuya's wrist. Hold on a second, will you? What? It took her a couple of seconds, but she was eventually able to slow her laughing into a slight giggle. Look, in all seriousness, you should probably play it cool for a while. You don't want to scare Naruto away by demanding he give you an answer or pressure him into a relationship he doesn't want. I don't want a relationship either, she exclaimed, not quite believing her own words. But do you want me to just act like it never happened? There's no way that'll work. I'm not saying you can't talk about it, but if he doesn't bring it up, you shouldn't either. Give the guy some time to figure it all out, you know? Tayuya slowly nodded her head, finding Temari's advice to make a surprising amount of sense. She herself couldn't make heads or tails of the situation, so Naruto would definitely be lost. I guess. Thanks. No problem. Although I gave it a week before you two are, she once again shoved the pointer finger of her right hand into her left, trying not to laugh at the disgusted look on Tayuya's face. That's it, I'm fucking out of here. You can't deny it forever, she called as Tayuya stalked away. Once she was far enough away to not be seen, Temari grinned. The next couple of months were going to be fun. Lying in bed, Naruto stared up at the ceiling of the bedroom. Technically, he wasn't supposed to be here. Technically, Tayuya still hated him and had never given him permission to come crawling back to their bed. Somehow, though, he didn't think she'd mind too much. He nervously licked his lips and glanced towards the open doorway for the 10th time in as many as minutes. Any minute now, Tayuya would come walking in, freshly showered and ready for bed. Her long red hair would still be fairly moist and limp since she hated drying it, and she'd smell like fresh strawberries with a hint of grass mixed in. It was an odd combination now that he thought about it, but it was one he wouldn't change for the world. The soft padding of bare feet on hardwood immediately drew his attention, and he quickly sat up in case Tayuya actually did try to attack him. Oh, you're in here, Tayuya said, pausing slightly in surprise before continuing to walk into the room. Naruto shrugged and smiled weakly, relieved that she didn't seem upset by his presence. I figured this would be the best time to catch you. I wanted to talk. Her face dropped into a slight frown, causing him to do the same. Well, that wasn't a good sign. What did you want to talk about? She asked, standing unsurely at the foot of the bed. She ignored Naruto's incredulous stare in favor of looking down at her quickly chipping toenail polish. It had been Temari's idea to paint them, and just like she figured, the junk hadn't even lasted a full day. It was impossible for it to stay on since they trained every day and wore open-toed sandals most of the time. The kiss, Naruto said exasperatedly, unable to believe that she was going to try to sweep the whole thing under the rug. Tayuya winced. Oh. Yeah. She bit the inside of her lip and looked around the room, refusing to meet his gaze. Sorry. The silence between them was deafening. Both were at a loss for what to say, but for very different reasons. Finally, Naruto was able to find his voice again, though just barely. Sorry? He practically whispered. I don't know, like me back, he mumbled. At this, the redhead snapped her head up to look at him. Her heart hammered against her ribcage, and her body suddenly felt warm all over. Liked you back? Wait, do you like me? Asking him the question made her feel like a little girl with her first crush, but she didn't care. Not right now. Naruto's face was flushed, and now it was he who couldn't meet her eyes. Well, yeah, I guess. I dunno. A slight pressure on the bed made him glance up, and he was surprised to see that she was now sitting on the bed facing him. The way her light brown eyes stared intently into his was a little intimidating if he was being honest with himself, and he could practically see the eagerness in her eyes. Do you or don't you? Spit it out. Now full on blushing, he sighed angrily and shrugged. I do, okay? He never got to finish his sentence as Tayuya had sprung forward and kissed him, shoving her lips forcefully against his. He just barely remembered to kiss her back this time, and his arms instinctively wrapped themselves around her waist. She crawled forward another few inches and forced him back against the headboard, wanting to get as much of his lips as possible even though there was nothing more to take. She felt her head pound with excitement, or maybe it was her heart, and the only thing keeping her from moving even closer to him was the feeling of his hands pushing her back by the shoulders. They panted roughly, staring at each other with a mix of confusion and disappointment. She still felt too lightheaded from the kiss to form a complete sentence, so she uttered the only word she could grasp. Why? Naruto seemed to be similarly out of sorts as he took a few seconds to speak. Why did you say sorry for kissing me? Tayuya sat back on her haunches, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Her mind was suddenly a lot clearer, almost as if it had sobered up after a long night of drinking. Well, you were the first guy I ever kissed, and I didn't really ask if it was okay with you. I thought you might be mad. A dark look flashed across his face, but it disappeared almost as soon as it came. I'm not the first guy you kissed. You kissed Musashi, remember? He mumbled, unable to stop the bitterness from creeping into his voice. He instantly knew he'd said the wrong thing when he saw her furious expression. Gone was the beautiful, slightly shy Tayuya he'd just been kissing. She was back to her normal, angry self again. Let's get one fucking thing straight, she spat, grabbing his chin tightly in her hand. Musashi kissed me. All right? He wanted to argue that that was a technicality, but at the same time, he realized that he was being stupid. It was just the thought that someone else had tasted her lips before he rubbed him the wrong way. He felt horribly selfish, but he wanted to keep Tayuya to himself now that he had her. He never wanted her to even touch another guy, let alone kiss them. Naruto blinked at this train of thought, realizing how ridiculous he was being. He was acting creepy and possessive when they hadn't even agreed on anything. Sorry, he mumbled, only half meaning it. Her anger immediately dissipated, and he was relieved when she smiled again. Whatever, doesn't matter. She leaned forward and pecked him on the lips, finding the simple action addictive. Each time she did it, a slight tingle ran from her lips to her toes, and before she knew it, she was moving in for another. Tayuya squeaked slightly when Naruto flipped them around and laid her on her back, apparently growing tired of her setting the pace. She barely had time to reorient herself before he was kissing her again, this time slowly and softly. She couldn't decide whether to keep her eyes open or closed, and her arms lie awkwardly at her sides, But all of that changed when she felt his hand tightly grip her hip. A groan slipped out of her throat, and almost against her will, her hips pressed up into his. She was only wearing a tank top and a pair of shorts, having decided to forego underwear since she frankly found them uncomfortable to sleep in. If she'd known that this was going to happen, she might have reconsidered. When his chest accidentally brushed against her quickly hardening nipples, she gasped and broke the kiss, only to have him find her lips again a second later. Their kissing wasn't as clumsy as she thought it'd be, and surprisingly enough, it was actually getting better. Much better. His hands were beginning to roam a bit, rubbing her sides and stomach in slow, lazy strokes. He was being careful not to get too close to any of her more private areas, which was something she both appreciated and loathed. Half of her wanted him to just rip her clothes off so that they could really start having fun, but the other half was glad that he wanted to take things slow. It made her feel like he truly respected her, even if she didn't necessarily want him to. As he hovered above Tayuya, Naruto's mind began to race. What about Sakura-chan? A voice that sounded distinctly like the Kyuubi's retorted, what about her? And even though he was loath to admit it, he had to admit that the voice had a point. Tayuya was just as beautiful, smart, nice, when she wanted to be, and probably twice as sexy as Sakura, especially considering that the girl beneath him was at least a full cup size larger. His eyebrows furrowed slightly at the thought of her being sexy. If he was being honest with himself, he'd always been sort of attracted to her. Even when she wasn't walking around in skimpy night clothes, everything about her commanded his attention. Her strength, her laugh, the cute way her nose crinkled when she scowled. In fact, her attractiveness was the reason he'd nearly ruined one of his best shirts the night before. After waking up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, he'd returned to their bed to see that Tayuya's dress had ridden up well above her waist, fully exposing the simple, black boy shorts she'd been wearing underneath. His nose had immediately begun to drip blood as it all rushed to his head, and it had taken the better part of 10 minutes to wash most of the stain out. Being the gentleman he was, he'd pulled her dress down upon returning to bed in what had to be the scariest 30 seconds of his life. He couldn't imagine how he'd explain himself if she'd woken up while he was straightening her clothes. He wasn't sure how long they made out, but at some point, their kissing had begun to slow until they were just staring at each other. When she broke out into a wide smile that reached her eyes, every coherent thought was instantly wiped from his mind. It was the first inkling he felt that he might actually be in love with her. He fully realized that it was probably a mixture of his hormones and the feel of her burning skin against his, but it was more than that. It had to be. Had enough of me already? She asked, raising an eyebrow in silent challenge. Naruto grinned down at her. Never. Satisfied by his answer, Tayuya leaned up on her elbows to place another kiss on his lips, closing her eyes to fully savor the contact. Never in a million years did she ever think this would happen. For years she was certain that she didn't even have a libido, but the butterflies flapping around in her stomach and her heartbeat going 200 miles per hour told her otherwise. When she reluctantly broke the kiss, he expected her to move to her side of the bed, but she instead simply rolled over and pulled his arm around her. He caught the hint and moved closer to her body, spooning her from behind, which was a bit awkward since he hadn't fully calmed down yet. She didn't seem to mind, though, so he tightened his grip on her midsection and nuzzled his face into her hair before falling fast asleep. Chapter 37. Sunlight streamed through the window, gently signaling the start of another beautiful day. Or it would have been had the sun decided to not be an asshole and hit Naruto square in the face with a beam of light. Groaning slightly, Naruto tried to duck his head under his arm to hide from the sun, only to get a face full of something soft and sweet-smelling. He sputtered noisily and opened his eyes to see what the hell the stringy stuff in his mouth was. His eyes landed on Tayuya, who was curled up against him, and he felt himself smile. Memories of the night before flooded his mind, and for a few seconds he wasn't sure if he'd dreamed the whole thing or not. But then he saw the small hickey he'd left on her collarbone the night before and felt reasonably sure that he had, indeed, made out with Tayuya. He reached a hand over to brush her hair out of her face, marveling at how gorgeous she was. He'd always sort of noticed, but now that they were somewhat together, it was like he was seeing her for the first time. Her skin was nearly flawless except for a couple of pimples and scratches, her hair was rich and full, and her light pink lips were curved into the slightest smile. The thing that endeared him to her the most was that, even though she'd changed in dozens of ways since that night he'd woken up to her sleeping on his arm in the hospital all those years ago, she was still a drooler. He sighed and leaned over her, unable to resist placing a kiss on the corner of her mouth that wasn't leaking spit. She didn't stir, so he placed another one lower on her jaw and then another near her neck where he'd left his hickey. Her eyelids fluttered open after the last kiss and she yawned, rolling over to face him. She stared at him confusedly for a few seconds before smiling, eyes lighting up as she too seemed to remember what had happened. "Morning," she mumbled, wiping the spit away from her cheek. She was a little embarrassed, but he didn't seem to mind neither that nor her slight morning breath as he shifted forward and pecked her directly on the lips. "Morning." She yawned again and stretched her limbs out, wincing at the loud popping emanating from her joints. "So I guess last night wasn't a dream?" Naruto laughed a little, amused that she thought the same exact thing he had. "If it was the best one I've ever had." She smiled that bright smile of hers again, and he had to lean in for another quick kiss. Only this time, she wrapped her arms around his neck so that he couldn't move away. No matter how much she kissed him, she still couldn't believe that any of this was happening. 3 years ago she thought she'd die alone under a pile of trees, and now she was ferociously making out with a genin from the weak village of Konoha. Even though she was enjoying her current position, old habits died hard, so she broke the kiss long enough to turn him over so that she was on top and in control. She took a moment just to stare at him. This was hers. He was hers. She could do whatever she wanted now without feeling creepy or gross. She could play with his hair as much as she wanted, stare into his eyes, watch him sleep. Okay, that last one was still pretty creepy, but less so if they were together. "What?" he asked, a small grin on his face. She ran her hands over the wiry muscles of his arms and up to his face, pinching his cheeks between her fingers. "You're cute." "You're cuter," Naruto replied, reaching his hands up to do the same to her. Tayuya groaned and rolled her eyes. "I can't believe we just did that." "Me either," he laughed. "How did this happen?" "I wish I knew. You have no idea how much I'm freaking the fuck out right now." Despite saying that, she grabbed his arms and pushed them over his head, wishing that she'd made him lose his shirt the night before. She knew that realistically he was probably stronger than her, but she just liked the idea of owning and being in control of him, as terrible as it sounded. She nervously bit her lip, not really sure what to do next. Her experience was pretty much nil, and except for one of Anko's racy books that she'd read out of boredom a year ago, she didn't have anything to even work off of. "Don't bite your lip," Naruto mumbled, looking away from her. Tayuya furrowed her eyebrows. "Why not?" She then noticed his grimace and smirked. "Does it turn you on when I do that?" "No," he lied unconvincingly. She slowly bit her bottom lip again and he closed his eyes, a pained expression flashing across his face. "Holy shit, you're kidding me. That really does it for you?" "Because you're doing it, yeah?" Tayuya felt her mouth drop open slightly. If she didn't know him as well as she did, she'd swear he was just saying these things to get into her panties. And if he was just trying to get into her panties, well, it was definitely working. "What's wrong?" he asked, looking up at her in that adorably confused way of his. Still gripping his face, she pulled his face to hers and kissed him, a little surprised at how bold she was being. She was running solely on her instincts, because if she stopped long enough to think about it, she might throw up all over him. She and Naruto were kind of, together. That short, annoying, loud-mouthed, weak idiot from the supposed weakest and stupidest village in the shinobi world was lying beneath her. She was kissing him. Naruto. Her whole world fell backwards, and it'd take some time for her to think of this as normal. Not that it was unpleasant. It was fucking great, actually. It just felt weird. Naruto sat up and grabbed her around the waist, lifting her up along with him. His hands slipped under the hem of her shirt and rubbed the soft skin of her lower back, and it was all he could do to keep them from going any higher. She moved her hands from his face and wrapped her arms around his neck, once again pulling him closer. Their teeth accidentally knocked against each other's, and they simultaneously held their fingers against them to stem the pain. "Ouch," Naruto said, laughing as he rubbed his mouth. "Sorry." She kissed his top lip as penance, leaning back and smiling sheepishly at him. "It's okay." He leaned forward, gently, since banging against her teeth had hurt quite a bit, and captured her lips in another kiss. They continued to languidly make out, their breath coming in short, rough pants. Maybe it was because they were shinobi and knew their time was short, or maybe it was just because this was a long time coming, but they couldn't get enough of each other. Tayuya pressed her chest against his until she was flush against him. She could feel him poking her thigh through her thin shorts, but she barely noticed. At least not until she felt his hands on her stomach, lightly pushing her back. "Wait," he said, breaking their kiss. Her eyes took a few seconds to adjust, but she was eventually able to look at him. "What?" "We need to talk about this." Tayuya's mouth formed a thin line, and she leaned back a little further to glare straight at him. "Okay. Talk." He could hear some hostility slipping into her tone and realized that she was automatically assuming the worst. It kind of stung that she thought so little of him and was expecting him to hurt her, but he brushed it off. This was new for the both of them, so of course she'd be wary. "Are we gonna tell anyone about this? About us being like you know?" She visibly relaxed at his question, and he had to wonder what she thought he was going to say before. "Oh." Tayuya cocked her head, screwing up her face, and thought, "Maybe we shouldn't. People will just bug us about it." "I was thinking the same thing. We should wait until this trip is over." "Yeah, that might be best. The less drama the better, at least until we get back to the village. Then I want everyone to know that they better keep their skanky paws off of you." She started to lean forward to kiss him when he stopped her by speaking again. "Tayuya." "Yeah?" She answered a little too quickly, slightly miffed that her lips weren't pressed against his. "I mean, go ahead." I'm really happy right now." Tayuya felt her entire body blush. It was like he knew exactly what to say to make her insides turn to mush. He'd found her heart underneath all of the bullshit, and was doing everything he could to make sure that he kept it forever. The worst, or best, part was that it was working if the full, toothy grin on her face was to be believed. "Me too." Spinning lightly on her toes, the girl used her chakra to keep herself standing on the water. Long, fluid strands of liquid surrounded her, and she expertly manipulated them into 9 whip-like tentacles. Despite how beautiful they looked as they lashed and swirled around her, the tendrils weren't just for show. Anyone who got within 10 feet of her would receive at best a large gash and at worst would lose a limb. She'd done this nearly every night for the past 3 years, honing her chakra control and building dozens of new techniques in an effort to get stronger. She was tired of being weak. She was tired of always being overlooked. She was tired of being herself. With a final exhalation of breath as she released the technique, Hyuga Hinata deactivated her Byakugan. She stared at her reflection in the now still water, smiling at how much she'd changed in nearly 3 years. She'd let her dark blue-violet hair grow to the middle of her back, her breasts had jumped nearly 2 cups in size, and she had more confidence than ever, especially with guys staring and consistently asking her out on her dates. She'd accepted nearly all of them, reasoning that they would make good practice for when Naruto returned, and plus it was fun to get free food, but she never went on a second date. She'd learned the hard way that guys' expectations increased with each subsequent date, and he'd learned the hard way that you never tried to force yourself upon a Hyuga. Exhaling again, she allowed herself to fall backwards into the water, using chakra to cushion her descent so that she simply floated onto her back. Her large, pale eyes stared up at the moon, and she found that she was unable to stop a wide smile from breaking out on her face. She couldn't believe it was almost time for him to come home. Everything would have fallen into place, if only it weren't for her. That hideous, conniving, red-headed bitch who was on the training trip with him. She wasn't so naive as to believe that she hadn't tried to dig her claws into her Naruto-kun, and knowing how lonely he was, he'd probably succumbed. One of her deepest regrets was not making her feelings known before he left. Hinata clasped her hands over her chest, wincing at the dull aching coming from her heart. Even after all this time she couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he smiled, the way he laughed, and the way he always made her feel good about herself without even trying. It was no wonder the slut was all over him. But she didn't care for him like Hinata did. She didn't know him or what he'd been through, so she had confidence that she'd be able to win him back. Of course, she wasn't delusional. She knew her father wouldn't stand for her dating someone who wasn't royalty, and the village pariah, no less. That's why she was consistently squirreling away money into her own separate bank account. Even if her father disowned her and kicked her out of the house, she'd be fine. Between her nest egg and the B-ranked mission she went on, she'd be able to afford a decent living until she and Naruto were married. If they moved in together, even better. A shy, elated smile appeared on her face at the thought of starting her life with him. She wanted a minimum of 2 kids, but with how often she estimated they'd have sex and the failure rate of current contraceptives, that number could easily pass 5. Hinata shook her head and removed her hand from her breast, shaking the dirty thoughts from her mind. Lately, her imagination had been growing out of control. Besides, she was getting too far ahead of herself. He wasn't even back in town yet. After swimming to shore and pulling on her clothes, she took one last glance at herself in the still water and smiled. When Naruto got back, he wouldn't know what hit him. A slight shudder went up Naruto's spine, forcing him to gasp and break his kiss. It was a weird feeling, almost as if someone was plotting something evil about him. Which wouldn't be that far-fetched considering how many enemies he had. "What's up?" Tayuya asked, furrowing her eyebrows as she looked up at him. Or at least she tried to. It was dark in the second-floor hall closet where they were currently making out. Naruto shook his head, not wanting to worry her over a stupid feeling that probably meant nothing. "Do you ever feel like all we do is make out nowadays? I mean, I love doing this, but I really miss just talking to you as your friend." She smirked and rolled her eyes. "Don't be such a bitch. We're talking right now, aren't we?" "A bitch, huh?" He flipped them around so that he was the one pushing her against the wall, eliciting an uncharacteristically girly squeal from her throat that was becoming more and more common. "I didn't know you were into women." "Of course I am. I'm into you, right?" she teased, a challenging look in her eyes. "Oh, now you've done it." He attached his lips to the one spot he knew would wipe the smirk right off of her face, and was instantly rewarded when she leaned her full weight against him. She moaned loudly into his ear and he couldn't stop himself from smiling. The first time he decided to try her grandmother's advice about their family's weak spot, Tayuya had screamed loudly. He'd barely had enough time to separate himself before the entire house had stormed into their room, weapons raised and ready to fight. Luckily they'd been able to explain it away as a nightmare from her time with Orochimaru, and since Enko occasionally had similar dreams, no one had really questioned it. From that night on, though, he always made sure to work his way up to that spot so she wouldn't be too surprised. "Not bad, Toots. Keep that up and I might let you make me a sandwich," she panted, hanging onto him for dear life. Naruto laughed, blowing warm air on her neck. Even when she could barely stand, she had something smart-ass to say. He loved that about her, how he never knew what she would say or do next. Occasionally that was bad for him, but most of the time, it was what he looked forward to day in and day out. "Naruto! I'm leaving!" A loud voice called from somewhere in the house. "Shit, is it 10 already?" Tayuya mumbled, pulling down her shirt and straightening it as best she could in the dark. "I'll go first." Naruto leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek before slipping out of the closet and jogging down the stairs to meet Kankuro. After he left, Tayuya pressed her ear against the door. She was waiting to hear the sound of the front door slamming so she'd know when it was safe to leave without being seen by them, since it'd be a little suspicious if they both suddenly appeared from the same direction looking breathless and disheveled. While she waited, she for the millionth time pondered how strange her life was now. To go from years of feeling angry all the time to nothing but happiness, to be honest, it frightened her. Her anger was a huge part of who she was. It was what had kept her alive up until this point, and it was what gave her the strength to keep living when she felt like ending it all. Between reconciling the bullshit with her grandmother and finding someone who seemed to think she was the best thing to ever walk the earth, well, she just didn't have much to be angry about. Her hatred for children and furry animals felt more like a dull loathing now, and the minor annoyances like chirping birds or bright sunshine didn't even register to her anymore. She still wanted to run a sword up Orochimaru's ass, but that was more of an obligation than anything. Pretending to be angry when she wasn't was a problem she never thought she'd have. It was a chore just to keep up the act for the sake of everyone else, and it was a wonder no one had caught on yet. The worst part was she didn't mind it at all. She actually liked being happy, even if it changed her. Even the little things like hand-holding and staring into each other's eyes that she used to find disgusting were suddenly her favorite things to do, even though they couldn't do them very often. On the downside, she found that she had a rather intense jealous streak. If another girl so much as stared at Naruto, she'd make a point to show that she owned him by either kissing him or grabbing his arm. She'd always been sort of possessive of his attention since she was his best friend, but now that they were unofficially dating, well, she wasn't sure what she'd do if any of them actually tried to touch him. While she was lost in her thoughts, she didn't feel the door begin to open, and it wasn't long before she was sent tumbling to the ground outside. "What are you doing?" Temari asked, staring down at Tayuya with honest surprise. Embarrassed that she'd been caught, the redhead got up and brushed herself off, doing everything she could not to meet the blonde's curious gaze. "None of your business." Unperturbed, Temari took in her appearance. Her eyes scanned her messy hair, her flushed cheeks, her bruised lips, her lightly heaving chest, and a second later, her eyes widened. "You and Naruto were just making out here, weren't you?" Tayuya's first reaction was to run. She knew Temari was perceptive, but fuck, she'd hit the nail right on the head on the first try. They'd been so careful to keep their activities under wraps, so the fact that she'd even gotten close frightened her. Who else was starting to figure it out? Acting on instinct, she screwed her face up into disgust, hoping it was convincing enough to throw Temari off. "No! Gross!" But it was too late. A huge, knowing smile had already broken out on the Jounen's face. "It makes sense now. I just saw Naruto come running around this corner looking all pleased with himself, and now here you are with the same exact look on your face. Don't deny it." Tayuya desperately moved in front of Temari and forced her to look her in the eyes. "But you're wrong. We aren't like that." "Yeah?" Temari lunged forward before Tayuya could react and grabbed her by the shoulders. She moved her long, red hair out of the way, pulled down the neck of her shirt, and Tayuya instantly knew that it was over. Holy, Naruto's been busy. She was sweating, she was blushing, and she felt sick. The worst part was that she didn't know why she was even embarrassed. Maybe because she hadn't been prepared to suddenly tell anyone, or maybe it was because she knew that there were a minimum of 5 hickeys in her collarbone area alone. He really seemed to like marking his territory. How long? Now that the jig was up, she saw no point in lying. Besides, Temari usually had good advice and she could use a confidant. Shoulders sagging, she hung her head and sighed. "A month." The Jounen's mouth dropped open. "A month? You two have been making out and Cammy knows what else for a whole month without me noticing?" Nervously glancing around the hallway just in case someone else was home, she leaned forward and scowled. "Keep it down. Fuck, just tell everybody, why don't you?" "I ought to. I'm the one who got you two together in the first place. Going to the club was my idea, and who gave you the advice to just let it happen naturally? And you just decided to not tell the most important person in this equation that all of their hard work paid off?" "Why does it matter to you?" Tayuya asked, a little shocked by her strong reaction. Temari looked at her as if she were stupid. "I thought we were friends." "Friends tell friends when they're getting some," she said, speaking slowly as if talking to a toddler. Ignoring the blonde's extremely condescending tone, she raised her eyebrows. "Friends? You and me?" she asked, pointing between the two of them. "Well, yeah. Aren't we?" Tayuya blinked. Sure, Naruto was her friend, and Anko was sort of her friend/sister, but she and Temari were bitter enemies. She'd almost killed Temari's boyfriend, and in return, Temari had almost killed her. Them being friends after all, that seemed impossible, but here they were. The strangest part is that she didn't hate her anymore. In fact, they actually had a lot in common. Blinking at this realization, she hesitantly answered her question. "I guess?" At that moment, a huge grin broke out on Temari's face. "So tell me everything. Friends don't keep secrets from friends." The redhead scowled. She couldn't help but feel like she'd been led into a trap. At the same time, she was relieved. Even after 4 weeks of continuous encounters, she was still confused and a little bit freaked out about being with Naruto. It felt natural, but it didn't. She always felt like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, like someone was just biding their time so that they could pull the rug out from under her as soon as she fully gave herself to him. She took a deep breath and decided to say what had been bothering her ever since their relationship started before she lost her nerve. "I don't think I belong with Naruto." The words scared her, but strangely, saying them out loud made her feel a little better. Temari blinked, obviously not expecting her to say that. "What?" "It's not that I don't like being with him, it's just," she shrugged her shoulders lamely. She didn't know how to explain feeling. "You feel like it's too good to be true?" "How did you know?" Temari sighed and sat down on the floor, motioning for Taiya to do the same. It was like that with me and Shika. I've always been independent and a little jaded, so after a while, I just didn't think the whole love thing was for me. I didn't really like most guys I came across, so when he kissed me I got confused. I'd already given up on love, but now all of a sudden I had it. It's completely normal in your first relationship, trust me. I've asked around. But what if it doesn't work out? Then it doesn't work out. So what? You know that you're capable of being happy with someone now. You've had the experience, so you can either decide to be alone or find another guy even better than him. Taiya slowly nodded her head, chewing thoughtfully on the inside of her bottom lip. I guess that makes sense. Even though she said that, she couldn't imagine finding a guy better than Naruto. He was the only guy she'd met in her nearly 17 years of life that was just so genuine. She didn't want to say he was perfect, far from it, but she'd be hard-pressed to find another shinobi like him, because there was no way in hell she'd settle down with a civilian. All of a sudden a wave of realization passed over her, drenching her in self-doubt. What was she doing with a guy like Naruto, anyway? She herself thought that he was amazing, and she, well, wasn't. She felt the backs of her eyeballs sting, so she tightly clenched her teeth in an effort to stem the tears that were threatening to fall. The thought had crossed her mind before, but it was always fleeting. He'd smile or kiss her, and she'd immediately forget that he was out of her league. But Temari had made her realize just how strange it was for them to be together. She didn't have parents. She wasn't from the Fire Nation, and was in fact from the country of one of their worst enemies. She'd attacked their village, killed their shinobi, helped kidnap the last Uchiha, and just generally been a pain in the ass for Konoha for the last 7 or so years. In her efforts to comfort her, Temari had inadvertently made things worse. They were both quiet for a few minutes, each unsure of what to say next after such a heavy conversation. Finally, Temari turned to Taiya with raised eyebrows and a curious smirk. So, have you fucked him yet? Since the academy was relatively close to where they lived, Naruto and Kankuro were able to make it on time by simply jogging even though they were supposedly running late. As soon as they rounded the corner, Naruto was hit with an intense wave of déjà vu. The first thing Naruto noticed about the academy building was that it looked eerily familiar. It took a few seconds, but he eventually realized that except for the materials used to build it, sand and rock, it was the spitting image of Konoha's academy. Still in a mild state of shock, he followed Kankuro into the school where even the hallways and classrooms looked the same. As soon as they walked into the room for 6-year-old students, the children all gasped excitedly and jumped to their feet, eyes shining and smiles wide. It's Kankuro-sama. Kankuro-nai-chan. Over here, Kankuro-nai. You're popular, Naruto joked, staring amusedly at the star-struck expression on the children's faces. Kankuro rolled his eyes. Do you think so? Watch this. He cleared his throat dramatically to quiet the kids down before speaking. Everyone, say hello to Uzumaki Naruto-sensei. If it were possible, the children's eyes opened even wider. You're the one who beat Kazekage-sama? One boy asked from the back of the classroom. Suddenly embarrassed, Naruto regressed into his nervous habit of scratching at the back of his head. It was a few years ago, but yeah, that was me. The classroom burst into hushed, excited whispers. Finally, one short blonde girl had the courage to ask him another question. Are you gonna be teaching us today? He grinned widely in response. Sure am. A few seconds passed before he realized that they were all waiting for him to, well, teach, so he clapped his hands together and motioned towards the window. Everyone go to the training field and we'll get started. As they sprinted, out of the room, Naruto leaned over to talk to Kankuro. Your academy is kind of similar to ours, he said, looking around at the classroom again. I guess, but trust me, it wasn't like this before. Until Gaara took over it was much harder to become a shinobi, but since we need the manpower, things are a lot more laid back. Like Konoha's academy. Hey! Kankuro laughed and nudged his shoulder before walking towards the classroom door. What? I didn't say that was a bad thing. The kids are definitely happier with this structure, and they're producing roughly the same results, so no one can complain. They reached the outside training area to see all of the kids lined up and ready for whatever he had to say. The kids looked up at him expectantly, barely able to contain their excitement. To be honest, it was sort of intimidating. Not counting Konohamaru, he never actually taught anyone before, and especially not a group this big. He was a little nervous about letting them down, but at the same time, he was excited. He'd have an indirect hand in what kind of shinobi these kids would become. Sure, it was only for a few hours, but it was invaluable practice. Okay, here's what we're going to do, trying to remember what he'd done when he himself was a student. Kankuro and I are going to split you up into 2 groups. We'll be teaching you how to throw kunai today, and if you guys do well, we'll even teach you how to throw shuriken. First though, I want 3 laps around the field to get you warmed up. Before the words were out of his mouth, the kids took off, racing each other to be the first one back. Kankuro whistled as he watched them go, a genuinely surprised look on his face. Whoa, I've never seen them so happy to run, he commented. They're already on the 3rd lap. Just as he'd said, the kids finished their laps and lined up again, some of them doubled over as they struggled to catch their breath. Feeling a little sorry for them, Naruto gave them a few minutes before he began the lesson. Alright, you 10 are with me. The rest of you go with Kankuro. Both he and Kankuro gave a quick demonstration on how to throw a kunai and basically told them to go nuts, with dulled kana, of course. There really wasn't much he could teach him about this. He'd learned firsthand that the key to getting good at anything was simply to practice. Sure, there was a certain technique to throwing weapons, but most people picked it up subconsciously after 10 or so throws. A small frown appeared on his face as he noticed an awkward brown-haired girl in his group who was sucking badly. Apparently she was the exception. None of her throws even grazed the target, let alone hit the bullseye, and most of them wobbled pathetically before digging into the ground. He felt an odd connection to the girl as he watched her fail time and time again, and it wasn't until the other kids began to make fun of her that he realized it. She reminded him of him. Being careful to avoid the wild tosses of the students as he approached her, he knelt down next to the girl and smiled. Hey, need some help? The little brunette looked over at him and frowned. What do you want, old man? Naruto choked on his spit. Old man? He was barely 16. Was he this bratty when he was a kid? Quickly recomposing himself, he pasted on a thin smile. What's your name? She narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously, gripping the dull kunai in her palm as she tried to decide if she should trust him or not. It seemed as if she saw something she liked, though, since she gradually relaxed her grip on the kunai and fully turned to face him. Kiko. Well, Kiko, you're doing this wrong. Here, hold the kunai like this, he said, adjusting it so that the handle rested loosely between her thumb and pointer finger instead of in her palm like she'd had it. Now, just let it fly with all your strength. Still staring at him dubiously, she tossed the weapon and it miraculously struck the spot she'd aimed for. Whoa! I hit the bullseye! The girl cheered, jumping up and down. Those guys said I was hopeless, but look! I hit it! He ruffled her short hair and handed her another kunai. Why don't you go show them what you learned? She smiled, nodded, and ran off to do what he'd said. He watched with a grin as she again hit the bullseye, earning gasps of amazement from her classmates, who immediately began asking her for tips. He spent the next 2 hours instructing the kids on how to throw kunai and shurikens since they'd done so well, and by the time lunch rolled around, all of the kids had hit the bullseye at least twice. It filled him with a sense of pride that he never felt before, and he knew that when he became Hokage, he'd definitely be stopping by the academy to teach every now and then, just like the Sandaime had done when he was a kid. Alright, awesome job everyone. You guys are gonna be great shinobi. The kids looked around at each other, obviously pleased with themselves and each other. Class is over for the day, teacher's orders. Go home. His smile widened as, instead of immediately leaving, the kids returned to practicing their weapon throwing. It was a good half hour before they finally began to disperse, and since they'd stuck around, he'd stayed to continue giving pointers. It was the most fun he'd had in a while, not counting making out with Tayuya anyway. This is what we're fighting to protect, isn't it? He asked, watching them laugh, smile, and play as they left the academy. I think I understand how adults feel now. Careful, bro, you're starting to sound like an adult yourself, Kankuro joked. You did a good job today. Come on, I'll buy you lunch. When he saw Naruto's eyes light up, the Jounin quickly modified his offer. Not ramen. 8 full hours later, Naruto finally returned to the house. Kankuro had indeed treated him to ramen, but only after dragging him around town for the first 7 hours to run errands. In other words, drink, gamble, and hit on chicks. Initially it had been fun hanging out with just a guy for a change, but he quickly learned that Kankuro's idea of fun was much different than his own. He was only relieved that Tayuya hadn't been around to see the girls hanging off of him. He walked into his bedroom with a tired sigh, but his mood was significantly lifted when he saw Tayuya lounging lazily on their bed, clad in nothing but a t-shirt and a pair of short shorts as she flipped through one of her music books. There wasn't anything inordinately sexual about her clothing, but seeing them on her just did something to him. It also helped that she was lying on her stomach, so he got a great view of her ass. At least until she rolled over to frown at him. "Why'd you get back so late?" Tayuya asked, a childish pout on her face. It still sort of amused him how different she acted around him now that they were together. She wasn't at all afraid to show what she was feeling, sometimes even going out of her way to make sure that he understood when she was unhappy with him. A second later, Naruto's amusement dissipated. Well, that wasn't completely true. Every now and then she'd get this sad look on her face when they fooled around, and even though he'd ask her what was wrong, she'd brush the question off and distract him with either a fierce kiss or an accidental touch to his naughtier bits. It ashamed him to admit it, but both of those things were more than enough to make him forget what he had for breakfast, so it stood to reason that they could easily make him forget an expression he wasn't even sure he'd seen. "Kankuro bought me lunch and it ran a little long." He fought down a guilty wince as he spoke. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either. "Oh yeah? How was it?" "It was cool. Suna has some weird food though. Can you believe they eat scorpions? Yuck." Rather than answer with some kind of smart-ass remark like she usually would, she smiled distantly at his answer, worrying him a bit. Something was wrong. "What about the academy?" Tayuya asked, still not quite sounding like herself. Even though he was concerned, he couldn't help the bright grin that appeared on his face. "It was awesome. All of the kids were so much fun, and they were eager to learn. There was one girl who reminded me of you," he said, pulling his shirt off over his head. Her face finally lit up a bit, and she curiously sat up on her haunches. "Yeah? How so?" Naruto shrugged. "I dunno, really, it was just a feeling." It could have also been her scowl and utter disrespect for authority. When she laughed, he continued, laughing a little himself as he thought of Kiko. "Teaching those kids reminded me of why I want to be the Hokage in the first place. Just like Sandaime-ji-chan did for me, I want to help those kids who might not have someone to teach them. I don't want anyone to be overlooked just because they have a little trouble understanding how to do something, and I definitely don't want anyone to be treated like they're not as good as everyone else just because of who they are." A resolute glare accompanied his statement, making Tayuya's smile fully drop. "Sometimes I think you're too good for me," she mumbled, frowning as she played with the ends of her hair. "Sometimes I think you are too." Tayuya could feel him staring at her, and after an entire minute, she couldn't take it anymore. "What?" He shook his head and smiled. "I can't get over how pretty you are." She felt that annoyingly familiar tingly feeling spread through her chest, and she lifted her head to glare at him. "That's not fair," she grunted. Naruto tilted his head and furrowed his eyebrows slightly, confused. "What's not?" The redhead sighed loudly and plopped back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. She couldn't explain it without making him upset. She couldn't say that he deserved better, that she was simply no good for him, and would ruin his dream of being Hokage. Or maybe she was worried that if she told him these things he'd realize she was right and that he deserved a girl like Sakura after all. Sakura was bratty and annoying, sure, but she hadn't done the things Tayuya had. She wouldn't bring Naruto down with her sins like Tayuya would, and no one would frown at him dating a smart, loyal kunoichi of the leaf. If she dated the girl who'd had a significant hand in killing the third Hokage, though. "Nothing," she whispered in a small voice, feeling stupid for allowing this to get to her so much. It was just fuck. She was feeling things now. Weird things. She wasn't just worried about herself, or how she felt anymore. Yeah, she'd always fussed over Naruto, but this was different. It actually scared her how much she valued his happiness. The bed shifted under her as the blonde kneeled on it, and she curled herself into a smaller ball, insistent on not letting him touch her. Naruto reached out for her, but she refused to move closer despite his best efforts. "Tayuya-chan?" The slight hurt in his voice made her feel bad, but she reasoned that she'd feel worse if she kept leading him on like this. It'd just be worse for the both of them when he finally realized exactly how much she'd screw up his life. It was kinder of her to make him lose interest before they got too serious. I'm really tired. The blonde frowned. It worried him that she was actively turning down the offer to fool around since she was usually the instigator, but he decided to take her word for it. He didn't know what she'd done during the time he was gone, so maybe she just trained too hard and needed to rest. It'd certainly explain why she wasn't acting like herself. Well, good night then, he mumbled, leaning over and kissing her on the cheek. The kiss left her cheek burning. She wanted to roll over, grab him, and never let go, but she couldn't. Not if she really cared about him. She didn't trust herself to open her mouth and reply, so she settled for a more noncommittal sound. She waited until his breathing slowed before she turned over to look at him. She reached a hand out and gently played with a lock of his long blonde hair, smiling sadly at how much the feel of it between her fingertips comforted her. She was going to miss this, but at least she'd had a month to experience what most people took for granted. Even if Naruto married someone else, and even if she never met another guy who could make her feel like she wasn't completely evil, she'd be satisfied. This is the way her life was supposed to be. Girls like her didn't get happy endings. Gaara placed the cookies on a plate, taking a strange, slightly obsessive-compulsive enjoyment in the way he had arranged them. The nights were made for him. Since he couldn't sleep with the Shikaku constantly trying to take over his mind and all, he'd usually spend his time either catching up on work or reading a good book. If he was in a particularly restless mood, he might even do a bit of training. Regardless of his night's plans, though, he always started with some milk and cookies. As he settled into his custom-made feather-stuffed chair that he'd picked up from Konoha a year or so ago, he heard the nearly silent sound of footsteps approaching from the stairwell. His eyes flickered up to see Naruto's second-best friend sneaking down the stairs. "Hi," he said, not quite sure how to greet the girl. He felt his lips twitch upwards when she jumped and twisted her head around to look at him, long red hair wrapping around her face. She seemed to calm down a bit after recognizing who he was, but he could tell just by the way she was staring at him that she was still uncomfortable in his presence. Something that bothered him more than he allowed himself to admit. "Oh. Hi." Gaara held out the plate towards her. "Cookie?" He noticed that she seemed to be having an internal battle of sorts with herself, and waited patiently for her to make a decision. Finally, she cautiously made her way over to him and reached a shaky hand towards the plate. "Thanks." She grabbed one of the chocolate chip cookies and seated herself in the chair across from him, giving herself more than enough room to get away just in case he decided to go bats hit. She trusted him as the Kazekage and as Naruto's second best friend, but not as a former psychopathic who couldn't sleep. They sat in an awkward silence for a few minutes, staring at each other as they tried to think of something to say. Well, at least he wasn't the only one who had trouble starting conversations. Gaara took a small breath, deciding to open with something light and innocuous. "Trouble sleeping?" Rather than answer, the girl shrugged. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because she wasn't sure how to. She couldn't exactly say that she hated herself and was slowly realizing that her sort of boyfriend was way too good for her and deserved better. Not to someone who knew him, anyway. She chewed gingerly on the treat, a little surprised at how good it tasted. She stuffed the rest of it into her mouth, barely chewing before swallowing it down her throat. "Who made these? Temari?" "I did. What's troubling you?" he asked, using his sand to send the cookies over to where she was. Sweets had a tendency to loosen one's tongue, and he was honestly curious as to why she looked so haggard. Tayuya shrugged her shoulders, grabbing 2 more cookies from the offered plate. He'd never given her a limit on the amount she could eat, so it was his own fault. Life in general. We live in a pretty fucked up world. "I agree. But that's not why you can't sleep." She sighed loudly, nibbling on one of the cookies in her hand. It wasn't like Gaara was going to tell anyone. Somehow he didn't seem like the gossiping type. "Well, we're going back to Konoha in a few weeks." Gaara nodded, slightly pleased that she was finally talking to him. They'd exchanged maybe a dozen words in the roughly month and a half she'd been there. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. He was always busy and rarely around, and she was always either with Temari or Naruto in their rooms. Sadly. "And well, I'm just anxious." I'm technically a shinobi there, but I've spent much more time on the road than I have in Konoha. Long story, she explained, noticing the way he cocked his head slightly. It's just when we get back, I'm going to be officially starting my life there. What if I don't fit in with those goody-goodies? If he were capable, he might have laughed. I can assure you that there are many less than decent people who reside in the Leaf. You'll be one of the better ones. Yeah, but only because Naruto's around. If Naruto weren't around, Konoha wouldn't exist right now. I'd have flattened it when I turned into the Ichibi. In fact, there probably wouldn't have even been a Konoha for me to flatten if the Kyuubi hadn't been sealed into his body. Thousands of people have been saved just because Naruto's been around. I failed to see your point. My point is that I'm not a good person. Naruto is, though, and I'm just pretending to be a good person so that he'll still like me. I should just have sighed and toyed with the cookie in her hands, picking the chips out with her fingernails. I should just leave him alone. Gaara was silent for a few minutes. His fingers were threaded in front of his face as he thought, and he stared over them at his fellow redhead. Just when she was about to ask him what the fuck was up, he spoke. You don't know Naruto very well. His statement pissed her off. As far as she knew, Gaara had only spent, at most, a month with him while she'd spent over 2 years with the blonde. Her first reaction was to tell him to fuck off, but she figured he deserved the chance to explain himself. What? She asked, barely containing her anger. Naruto can sense good people, and the fact that you even care about what kind of person you are tells me that you're good. Besides, if you weren't, Naruto wouldn't like you. And he certainly wouldn't be kissing you. Tayuya's eyes widened. How did you? I walked by your bedroom on the way to mine. I've heard the giggling. Her reddening face amused him. And to think he thought she couldn't get embarrassed. Just try to be the best person that you can be and everything will work out. Right after the words left his mouth, the boy cracked a rare, tiny grin. At least that's what I say to make myself feel better. Unfortunately, his words had the opposite effect. You don't fucking understand, she growled, raising her voice. You haven't seen what I have. You haven't done what I have. I'm not good for him. I'm evil. I've killed over 100 people, most of whom didn't deserve it, Gaara interjected. Her argument died in her throat at that. Well, shit, that's right. She'd actually forgotten that he used to be a violent, raging psychopath. Oh. You won't hold Naruto back. You'll help him. You know what it's like to live in the darkness. You know how we think, and you can be the one who keeps him from falling into it. After all you've been through, after all you've seen and done, Tayuya, he needs you. Just like you need him. Yin and Yang. Tayuya blinked. She hadn't thought of that, of Naruto needing her. Gaara had a point. Girls like Sakura weren't tough enough to deal with the shit he'd be going through in the next few years. They'd crumble under the pressure of what was basically war. It felt like a weight had been lifted off of her shoulders, and for the first time that day, she considered the possibility that maybe she was the best thing for him. Finally feeling sleepy, she stood up and stretched. Thanks, she said, smiling down at the younger boy. I'm glad you're one of Naruto's friends. And hopefully one of yours, too. Duh. Grabbing another cookie from his plate and giving him a small wave, she hopped back up the stairs 2 at a time, in a substantially better mood than she had been only 10 minutes before. Gaara watched her go with a satisfied smile on his face. Knowing that he'd helped his best friend, even if he didn't know it, filled him with a pleasure he couldn't describe. He felt like he was finally paying Naruto back for everything he'd done for him, though they'd never be completely square. In his opinion, there was absolutely nothing he could do to thank Naruto for giving him his life back. He reached for one of the treats, only to touch the cold, smooth porcelain of the dish. Surprised, his eyes shot down to where his hand rested on the plate. There was only one cookie left. Reading over the 4 scrolls, Naruto felt an intense amount of anger and confusion. True to his word, Jiraiya had given him all of the 4th's notes on the Hiraishin technique a month ago. He hadn't had much time to look over them with Tayuya taking up any free time he had left, but since she'd been acting strange lately, he suddenly found that he had all the time in the world and had been poring over them night and day. Only half of it really made sense, and that was because Omoe had taught him a little more about sealing while he was in Kumo. He didn't know how the 4th had done it, but somehow, he had managed to warp himself through time and space. Rather than just concentrating on where he wanted to go like with the Shunshin no Jutsu, he would have to lock onto both his exact location and the location of the seal. The seal then needed to be remotely activated by himself, which was no easy feat since he needed to lock onto the specific chakra signature of his seal. It also required that he have a general awareness of the location of each of his seals. Naruto rubbed his forehead, already feeling a headache coming on. This was ridiculous. The fourth was a genius, and even though he was definitely smarter than he was a couple of years ago, he was far from Yandame's level. The guy's head must have huge to hold such an obviously large brain. Luckily, Jiraiya chose that exact moment to walk by the room, and the blonde quickly hopped to his feet to catch him. Naero-sennin, do you know how to summon an object from one place to another? And when you seal an object, where does it go? The old man paused. You know, Minato asked me a very similar question when he was younger. Jiraiya stepped closer and looked over what Naruto had written down, eyebrows rising a bit as he tried to make sense of the scribbles. Are these your notes? Embarrassed, Naruto shrugged. Yeah, but they're stupid. They're just a bunch of doodles. The man shook his head. No, you're just a visual learner. They actually make sense. He straightened back up and rubbed at his chin. I can't say for sure, but Minato seemed to think that objects sealed into scrolls were placed into some kind of alternate space. However, that dimension still existed parallel to our own, so the object also exists in this one. It's just displaced, I guess you could say. For example, Mount Mayaboku exists in this world, and we can get to it, but we first have to pass into that dimensional space. I don't know if that helps at all. Naruto mumbled, scratching at his forehead. It kind of makes sense. I guess. Good luck. I'm proud of you for giving it a shot. I just want you to know that. The blonde grinned. Thanks, Ero-sennin. He waited for Jiraiya to leave and plopped back down on the couch. In a parallel dimension, he mumbled to himself after the left. His mind drifted to one of the books he'd read half a year ago about a group of friends who'd accidentally teleported themselves to a strange world. They'd only been able to escape after constructing a makeshift radio tower out of spare parts and sending an SOS beacon back to their own world. Naruto's eyes widened. That was it. Maybe he could somehow travel to this dimension, leave a piece of himself that would stay in that dimension, and create a link that would act as some sort of conductor and allow him to summon himself. But how would he get to that dimension? Was it even possible? He frowned deeply, annoyed that he'd once again another wall. Just when he thought he was getting somewhere. Hard at work? Tayuya asked, wrapping her arms around his torso from behind. She leaned her head around his shoulder, staring at his scroll with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. The blonde blinked, still finding it hard to come to terms with their relationship. It was weird having her be so nice. She was never really mean before, but she was definitely never this affectionate towards him. She still swore like a sailor, and she liked beating up people twice her size, but when they were alone, all of that stopped. She became a person who only shared her best smile with him and allowed only him to see her at her most vulnerable. It was like she was just waiting for them to get together before she let him in on the fact that she was a normal girl. It was both a huge honor and responsibility to protect her and her feelings, and it was one that he wouldn't trade for the world. They weren't officially boyfriend and girlfriend or anything, but they might as well have been. They could barely be in the same room without at least sharing a kiss, and more often than not, a whole lot more. And that was why he was careful whenever they were near each other. He didn't want to say or do anything to ruin whatever it was they were building, so he had, admittedly, been avoiding her. After what happened a couple of nights before, he was a little wary of her. Still, he answered her question, reasoning that. Kind of. I can't figure out how to get something to a parallel dimension so that I can use the Hiraishin. Really? Why don't you just go to Mount Mayaboku or whatever Ero-sennin mentioned? Tayuya asked, inadvertently revealing that she'd been eavesdropping on their conversation. She'd been waiting for the perfect time to apologize, but he always seemed too busy. She ignored the voice in her head that was saying she was just afraid to confront him. Naruto smacked himself on the forehead. You're a genius! I was just pointing out the obvious. I think you need to take a break. Your brain's fried and you're starting to turn back into stupid Naruto. Maybe you're right. I can pick this up tomorrow. He threw the scroll and his notes onto the chair and stretched, yawning widely as he did so. Thanks, Tayuya-chan. I don't know what I'd do without you. I mean it. His bright blue eyes stared unwaveringly into hers, and she knew that he really did mean it. He always meant what he said, even if she was sometimes too jaded to believe it. You'd be a weak-ass loser, duh. She pecked him on the cheek and sat down in his lap, slipping her arms around his neck this time. She leaned her lips up and placed them gently against his chin, feeling the fine whiskers that were just starting to come in. She placed another teasing kiss a little higher up on the corner of his mouth, smiling when he tried to capture her lips as she moved away. Don't, he murmured, glancing around to make sure that no one was coming. They were in one of the house's many dens, and while they hadn't heard a peep from anyone besides Jiraiya in the last hour or so, there was still a chance that someone could walk in on them. Tayuya rolled her eyes. No one ever comes to this side of the house. We're good. Naruto looked down at her and raised his eyebrows. So I guess you're feeling better? What was wrong? She shrugged her shoulders and smiled awkwardly. I was tired. Unconvinced, he narrowed his eyes. Really? Yup. He knew there was something she wasn't telling him, but when you have an extremely attractive girl in your lap practically demanding that you pay attention to her, you don't question it. You just don't. Well, are you tired now? She smirked slyly at him, understanding what he was getting at. She leaned up again and kissed him full on the lips this time, pulling away before he had a chance to even register what she'd done. Nope. Chapter 38. Hey, Tayuya-chan, have you seen the comb I got from Yugi-chan? I can't find it anywhere. Naruto shuffled through his bag, completely undoing any progress he'd made in the last half hour. His freshly washed clothing was strewn out all over the bed again, earning himself a frustrated groan from Tayuya. I packed it in my bag already. It's not like you've ever used it. Naruto stuck his tongue out at her and went back to packing, actually taking the time to refold his things. With all of the clothing he'd received from Gaara, he couldn't afford to just randomly toss things in like he'd been doing for the past few years. Besides, Tayuya would just take them out and repack them if he didn't do a good enough job, and he was really wary of annoying her since she was already in a bad mood. A small sigh distracted him from his task, and he took a second to glance up at her. He watched her stare out the window, and even though he already knew what the answer was, he asked the question anyway. What's wrong? Tayuya shrugged. I can't believe we're leaving tomorrow. Naruto grimaced. He hated seeing her so upset. Yeah, it sucks. But at least we can finally go home and see everyone, the blonde exclaimed, trying to get her as excited as he was about it. Sure, he would miss being in Suna, but there was no place like home. It had been 3 long years of harsh training and constant moving around, and he was more than ready to take it easy for once. Fully turning away from the window to face him, she rolled her eyes. You mean, at least you can go home and see everyone. Konoha's not my home, and I don't have anyone I'm interested in seeing there. Naruto frowned. It'll be your home soon, though, and my friends will be yours too. It'll be great, I promise. What if you're wrong? She asked. What if I hate them and they hate me? Well, as long as we're together, it'll work out. It always has so far, right? Besides, Anko will be there too. That's 2 people you can count on right there. Tayuya slowly nodded her head. She really couldn't deny that what he was saying was true. So far, the 2 of them had been able to overcome every obstacle that had been thrown their way. Still, this was different. They weren't both being thrust into a new situation, only she was. She dropped her shirt into her lap, feeling uncertainty begin to creep into her heart. Even if she did manage to fit in with Naruto and his friends, there was one very important thing that she'd been trying very hard not to think about for the last few years: Sakura. It was no secret to anyone who'd ever met Naruto that he'd been in love with her. It was a bit shrewd of her, but half of the reason she was so aggressive was to help him forget about the pink-haired Kunoichi. Hopefully her plan was working since he hadn't so much as mentioned Sakura since they'd kissed. Actually, he hadn't mentioned her since they were in the Earth Country. Still, she knew how hard it was to get rid of feelings for someone, so she couldn't necessarily be upset with him. For example, Misumi. Even when he taunted her, beaten her up, and stabbed Naruto, a tiny voice in the back of her mind still wanted him to drop everything and kiss her. As illogical as it was, he was her first crush. He was an arrogant, murdering asshole who never reciprocated her feelings, but her first crush nonetheless. With the Akatsuki, Orochimaru, and Sasuke all breathing down their backs, it amazed her that she was worried about Sakura stealing Naruto from her. And never mind that Sakura probably had very little interest in him. She tried to take him just because she could. That's just how women like Sakura worked. She stood up and walked over to where Naruto was sitting cross-legged on the bed packing up his pants. She sat down on his lap facing him, effectively stopping his actions, and lowered her lips to his. The kiss was slow and soft, different from their usually more rushed, frantic kisses. She poured every ounce of her feelings into it, and it was a good minute before she let him go. Naruto slowly opened his eyes to look up at her. Wow, he breathed. He couldn't help but notice that there was something else going on in that kiss. His entire body tingled, and the way she was looking at him made him a little nervous. In a good way. And don't you fucking forget it. She stood up and sashayed out of the room, leaving him positively dumbfounded. She was so much different from the boyish-looking, foul-mouthed, 14-year-old girl he met at the hospital. Well, she was still foul-mouthed, but to call her boyish-looking was simply laughable. To put it in simple terms, she was hot. He didn't know if it was instinct or learned behavior, but she seemed to know exactly how to keep his eyes on her. A smirk here, a cock of the hip there, and he was hooked. Naruto roughly shook his head, doing his best to stop thinking about it. They had yet to really define their relationship, but to be fair, they hadn't really been doing much talking lately. And it wasn't even that they were avoiding it. It was just impossible for them to talk for any significant length of time without wanting to jump on each other. Shaking his head again, the blonde tossed the pants he'd been packing up on the bed and followed her out of the room. Walking down the stairs, he was instantly met with the amused stares of Temari and Enko, and the horrified gawking of Tayuya and Kankuro. What? He asked, raising an eyebrow. When Temari's eyes flickered down to his crotch, he too glanced down at himself, only to see that he was sporting a rather large bulge in his pants. He quickly sped back up the stairs, mentally begging his penis to calm itself down. Luckily, the humiliation helped to expedite the process, and he sheepishly jogged back down a few seconds later. Something interesting happened up there? Temari teased, wriggling her eyebrows. Kankuro looked between Tayuya and Naruto, an expression of understanding slowly beginning to grow on his face. Wait, you and Tayuya? His sister laughed. Are you seriously just now realizing this? They'd been going at it for over a month now. Not wanting to be the only one who was too slow to realize what was going on, he desperately turned to his younger brother. Gaara? Unfortunately, Gaara only shrugged his shoulders slightly, giving Kankuro a somewhat pitying look. It was obvious. Tayuya finally broke out of her embarrassment-induced shock to look at the purple-haired jounin. Enko? You knew too? Of course I knew, Enko said, laughing at the redhead's shocked expression. Why do you think I've been giving you your space? Tayuya blinked. Now that she thought about it, Enko had been making herself scarce lately. She was usually around in the mornings and during training, but the rest of the time she'd simply disappear. It ashamed her a bit to admit it, but she'd been so wrapped up in Naruto that she hadn't even noticed. The main reason she was so surprised was because she was certain that Enko would have teased her about it. It was what she did best, and she couldn't so much as mention Naruto's name without receiving a generous ribbing. Perhaps she didn't know the woman as well as she thought she did. Realizing that they hadn't been as discreet as they thought, Naruto turned to the old man who was watching the scene from the couch with a slightly amused smirk on his face. What about you, Ero-sennin? Did you know? The man shrugged. You're old enough to make your own decisions. Besides, Tayuya keeps you in line. She's stricter than I am when it comes to your training. This time, Enko looked shocked. Apparently a lot had changed since they were on the border of the Lightning Country. She thought he'd never approve, but it seemed as if she was completely wrong about him. Then again, after nearly 2 years of being around the girl, there was no way he wouldn't have seen the good in Tayuya. Besides her strength and astounding skill with genjutsu, she genuinely cared about Naruto. Kankuro groaned loudly. So I'm really the only one who was clueless this whole time. And to think that I was trying to help you get law. So what's for dinner? Naruto cut in before his friend could finish his sentence, shooting a nervous glance Tayuya's way. He'd neglected to tell her about the many times Kankuro had taken him out to meet girls mostly because he didn't know how to. He loved being with her, but it was just nice to hang out with a guy for a change. Even if that guy was constantly introducing him to girls that Tayuya would kill him for speaking to. Gaara motioned towards the dining room. I ordered out since it's our last meal together. I bought every delicacy that Suna has to offer. What are we waiting for? Let's eat. Naruto led the way, glad to have an excuse to avoid the redhead's curious gaze. They all seated themselves at the table, and the genin immediately blanched when he saw the prevalent ingredient in most of the dishes. Great scorpions? Everyone laughed and dug in, and it was vastly different from their first meal altogether. For one, Temari and Tayuya weren't fighting. In fact, they were sitting right next to each other, laughing and joking with each other like they hadn't had a fight to the death only a few years prior. The tension that had been there when they'd arrived was also non-existent. They'd grown into a sort of dysfunctional family in their short 3 months together, and didn't feel the need to put up an act. The biggest difference, though, was that Naruto and Tayuya weren't sitting with each other. In fact, they were at opposite sides of the table. Neither of them felt the need to be connected at the hip anymore. They'd gotten to a place where they were completely comfortable being apart from one another for a while, and since this was the last time they'd be seeing their Suna friends for who knew how long, they decided their time was better spent with them. So, what's the first thing you're gonna do when you get back? Kankura asked, nudging Naruto on the shoulder. Naruto's eyes lit up. Get at Chiraku's, of course. I can't wait to see if they have any new flavors. It's been so long. A sliver of drills slipped out of his mouth, and he quickly lapped it up with his tongue. Oh, Tayuya, you'd better watch out. Naruto might leave you for ramen, Anko teased. The redhead shrugged. I know when I'm beat, she joked, shooting him a smile. He smiled back, earning a pained groan from Temari. Oh my god, you two are going to give me cavities. Kankuru rolled his eyes. Ah, come on, let them have their fun. You're just jealous because you don't have a man of your own. Tayuya and Temari exchanged a knowing glance. Yeah, that must be it, Temari said, smirking. The only one who noticed that there was something off about her tone was Gaara, whose eyes narrowed suspiciously in her direction. The rest of the meal passed too quickly, and it wasn't long before they were all heading up to bed. Tayuya showered first, and when she was done, Naruto took his turn. He emerged from the bathroom to see her zipping up both of their packs, and seeing the blank look on her face, he sat down on the floor next to her. He slipped an arm around her waist and pulled her into him so that her head rested on his shoulder, and she gratefully wrapped both of her arms around his torso. Our entire trip was stuffed into 2 bags, he stated simply. She lightly shrugged her shoulders. Yup. They sat on the floor for a good 10 minutes, both reminiscing a bit about all they'd done both together and apart. Finally, Naruto gently nudged her to get her attention. We should go to bed. We have a long day tomorrow. He stood and held his hand out to help her up, but she refused it and hopped up on her own, causing him to smile. She might be making out with him now, but she was still Tayuya. I know you're upset about going back to Konoha, but I really think you're gonna love it, he said again, pulling his shirt off to get ready for bed. He lay down and opened his arms, beckoning for her to join him. Tayuya snorted and rolled her eyes, flopping back onto their bed and snuggling up next to him. Oh yeah, I'm gonna love watching the entire village treat my boyfriend like shit. Frustrated, Naruto sighed. We've been over this, Tayuya-chan. I'm going to change their minds, you'll see. But you shouldn't have to. You haven't done a fucking thing to them. Shit, you've protected them. She yelled, sitting back up to glare at him. She felt her heart rate speed up, and she was sure that her cheeks were flushed with rage. Feeling himself start to become angry, he too sat up and turned to face her. It annoyed him that she was bringing this up again. It wasn't the first time she'd expressed her problems with returning, but she'd never gotten this upset about it before. So what do you want me to do, Tayuya? You want me to turn my back on the village I swore to protect? On my friends? Because that's not going to happen. Ever. Seeing the look on his face made her feel like a bitch. She wasn't asking him to abandon everything he knew for her, not exactly anyway, but she could see how he was getting that impression. She grabbed his large hand in her smaller one, squeezing it gently. I just hate to see you get hurt. Especially when you don't deserve any of it. Her fingers played with his, and he gradually felt himself calm down. She only lashed out when she was feeling self-conscious or worried, and since she'd been so calm lately, he'd forgotten that. What is this really about? I told you, I think you deserve more than what Konoha gives you. But it's my home. I want it to be yours too. Those fucking pleading eyes of his bore into hers, practically begging her to agree with him. The part that annoyed her the most was that she knew she would. She knew she'd do just what he wanted, try to fit in with those prejudiced assholes to make him happy. What else would she do? What else could she do? Even if she decided she didn't want anything to do with Naruto, and tried to make it on her own, she still had the tracking seal they'd put on her in case she ever tried to run. Best case, they just caught and imprisoned her. Worst, well, she'd had an alright life towards the end, so she couldn't complain too much. Fine, but I'll tell you now, I won't put up with anyone giving you shit, she pouted, slamming herself back on the bed and crossing her arms. He lowered himself down a little slower, still wary of her temper. He cared about her, but she scared the hell out of him sometimes. He wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing yet. He kissed her on the cheek and smiled, a little unsure if they'd actually resolved anything. Thanks. It was a full 5 minutes before something she'd said earlier sunk in. Boyfriend? Tayuya felt tears begin to gather at the corners of her eyes. She hated herself for feeling so weak. Temari had developed into her best female friend, which wasn't hard considering she didn't have anyone else to compete with besides Anko. In a way, she owed her entire relationship to the girl. She and Naruto might have gotten together on their own eventually, but it probably would have been years before either one of them grew a spine and made their feelings known. She wrapped her arms around the older girl, squeezing her as if she didn't ever want to let go. Thanks, she mumbled into her hair. A little put off by the action, Temari returned the hug, albeit with a little less strength. No problem. Women, Kankura murmured, watching the girls hug a few feet away. Despite saying that, he too looked like he wanted to cry. Turning away from the kunoichi, he threw his arms around Naruto and executed a perfect bro hug, patting him roughly on the back a couple of times before letting go. You know you guys are welcome in Suna anytime, right? Naruto grinned and nodded. Thanks, and likewise for Konoha. He then turned to Gaara and pulled Gaara into a hug which the redhead awkwardly returned. Naruto started to pull away, but the Kazekage held him fast. About your idea, Gaara whispered, voice low enough so that only Naruto could see him. You have my support. Naruto blinked. He'd actually sort of forgotten, figuring that Gaara wasn't interested in his plan. He wouldn't blame him. He himself was a little wary about the whole thing. So much could go wrong, and he wasn't sure if he could ever forgive himself if any of his friends got hurt because of him. Still, it was a necessity if he wanted to keep them all safe. It was a catch-22 if he ever saw one. Thanks, Gaara, he said, eyes shining with sincerity. I appreciate you doing that for me. It's not just for you. It's for everyone. A hint of a smirk appeared on Gaara's face. But mostly for you. The blonde laughed a little, shaking his head at how much different he was as compared to the murderess he'd met in the Chunin exams. I'll send a message to let you know what's going on when the time comes. I'll be waiting. Waiting for what? Temari asked, approaching them. The boys exchanged glances. Nothing, they replied simultaneously. The blonde rolled her eyes. Just take care of Tayuya, all right? Naruto blinked. Tayuya was the last person who needed to be taken care of. Huh. Temari smiled mysteriously. She's a little self-conscious. Again, Naruto found himself surprised. Tayuya? Self-conscious? It was hard to believe. She was smart, beautiful, an amazing kunoichi, and she wasn't allowed to be down on herself. About what? I can't really say. Just be there for her when she needs you. Okay? I guess? She exasperatedly shook her head but hugged him anyway, being careful not to hold it for too long since she could practically feel Tayuya's eyes burning into the back of her head. After another round of heartfelt goodbyes, the group set off towards Konoha, ready to face the final leg of their journey. It took them the better part of the day to make it out of the desert. 4 hours they only saw sand for miles, but eventually, Naruto pointed out into the distance, excitement palpable in his voice. Trees! I see trees! He yelled, grabbing Tayuya's shoulder and shaking it. Tayuya rolled her eyes, looking decidedly less enthusiastic. Great! Anko looped around her shoulders. Ah, come on, Taya-chan. We're going home. You can do whatever you want without me breathing down your back about training. That does sound pretty nice, she admitted. Despite how easygoing she was about most things, the Jounin was a veritable slave driver when it came to training. She was nearly as hard on her as Orochimaru had been, before he'd become fixated on Kimimaro and Sasuke, anyway. She was desperately looking forward to the break, and especially to just lounging in bed with Naruto without having to worry about the time or anyone walking in on them. There was always something going on in Suna, so they never really got the chance to relax together. They traveled another 15 miles before deciding to set up camp. It only took them an hour to get the fire going and a meal cooked, and 5 minutes later they were all sitting in a circle and eating together. There was a strange mood hanging over them, one of dread, excitement, and worry. Jiraiya sat back and cleared his throat, throwing the remains of his meal into the fire. Tomorrow, Naruto and I are taking a quick trip. What? Where? Tayuya questioned, eyes shooting from Jiraiya to Naruto. Mount Myaboku, Naruto chimed in. The redhead raised her eyebrows, a little surprised that this was the first she was hearing of it. Why didn't you tell me? Naruto shrugged. I just asked Ero-sennin a couple of hours ago. I was going to let you know tonight. She'd been wondering what they were talking about, and now she knew. It took her a few seconds, but she eventually realized why they were making the trip. Is this about Hiraishin? Yup. I'm going to use your idea and plant one of the kunai there and use it as a receiver. Tayuya rolled her eyes. Naruto, I threw that out there so you'd stop studying and make out with me. I don't think it's that easy. But what if it is? Then everyone would be flying all over the place. Naruto paused. She had a point there. Well, it can't hurt to try, he pouted. You're so cute when you're disappointed. She leaned up and kissed him playfully on the cheek, laughing when he turned his cheek away a second later. People are eating, Anko said, smirking at the scowl Tayuya sent her way. Whatever. Come on, Naruto, you're done. Huh. But I still have to finish my. You're done. He looked up, saw that look in her eyes, and quickly nodded his head. Couldn't eat another bite. He yawned exaggeratedly and stretched. I'm turning in. He quickly followed Tayuya to the adjacent clearing where their sleeping bags were set up. The two remaining adults stared at each other over the fire, both wearing equally disgusted expressions. Anko was the first to speak. Do you think there? I try not to think about it. Nah, you've got it all wrong, brah. Naruto gawked at the large orange toad, unable to believe the words that had come from his mouth. He was currently on Mount Myaboku, and after finding Gamakichi, he and Jiraiya had split up to take care of their own personal business. What? How can it be wrong? He asked, even though Tayuya had told him the exact same thing the night before. He still wasn't quite ready to give up on his idea. The Hiraishin is a space-time jutsu. It's got nothing to do with summoning, brah. At least not that type, Gamakichi croaked, hopping along beside Naruto. Grudgingly coming to realize that he'd have to start from scratch in his research, he crossed his arms and frowned. How do you know? The toad shrugged. Dad told me. How does he know? Ask him yourself. He motioned for him to follow, so shrugging, Naruto did just that. They walked and hopped together up a steep hill, and after getting about halfway up, they both had to use chakra to stick to the nearly vertical cliff wall. Finally they reached the top, and the first thing Naruto saw was the boss toad, Gamabunta, reclining lazily on his side, pipe sticking out of the side of his mouth. I heard you were here, the toad boomed, what looked like a smirk popping up on his face. Where's that brat Jiraiya? Gamakichi hopped forward. He's talking to the elders, Pops. He'll drop by later. What do you want? Feeling a little nervous, Naruto took a few steps closer to the huge toad. Well, I was wondering what you could tell me about Hiraishin. I thought it had something to do with a parallel dimension, but Gamakichi says that's wrong, he frowned, sticking his tongue out at the smaller toads retreating back as he left to head back down the mountain. The toad turned around just long enough to raise his middle finger before disappearing over the edge. The Hiraishin, eh? You're right about the parallel dimension. You have to step into the other direction and then come back. Time passes differently in this dimension, so while it seems like you're taking 5 seconds and 30 steps in that one, barely even a millisecond has passed in this one. That's it? Naruto asked, surprised at how simple it seemed. There had to be more to it. That's it? The giant toad choked out, sitting up a little. The Hiraishin shortens your lifespan the more you use it. Not by a whole lot, mind you, but you lose a few seconds each time. And those seconds add up over time. The blonde shrugged his shoulders, not really caring if he died sooner. The Sozo Seze had already killed Taiyuya's, so at least they'd be able to die at roughly around the same time. I don't get it. How does the seal and Kunai come into this? The seal serves as a marker. Minato used to describe the other dimension as dark and empty, a void, you could say. One step in that dimension could put him hundreds of miles away in this one. The marker gives off a unique glow that only he can see so that he knows where to exit. Naruto titled his head. He thought he'd had it, but now it wasn't making sense anymore. Wait, so how does it work if there are multiple markers? Won't they be in completely different places in the other dimension? All of the markers he places are in the same place relative to himself. Wherever the Kunai are in this dimension will be there in the void, only they'll exist as glowing lights. I still don't get it. How does he keep track of where he is? Naruto asked, feeling himself begin to get frustrated. He appreciated that Gamabunta was trying to explain it in simple words, but that didn't make it any easier. The large toad took a short puff from his pipe before speaking. By taking a mental snapshot. It takes a lot of practice, but you can train your mind to remember things in a second. No one said it was easy, and that's why the fourth was called a genius. Well, I'm obviously not nearly as smart as him since I have no idea how to do any of that. It's something you have to experience to really understand. The blonde was quiet for a few minutes as he attempted to process this new information. Things were gradually beginning to fall into place, but there was one giant, gaping piece that needed to be filled before he could go any further. So how do I get to this other dimension? Gamabunta cracked a grin. Ah, that's the hard part. You have to find it. Naruto was dumbfounded. I have to find my own dimension? Is that even possible? Minato believed there were an infinite amount of them, with most of them being completely devoid of life while existing parallel to our own. He used a complex seal to search for one, and once he found it, he had the key to it tattooed on himself. He studied the Sharingan extensively to figure out how to find it in the first place, though having the second Hokage's notes certainly helped. Naruto couldn't help but marvel at exactly how smart the fourth Hokage was. He never in a million years thought to study the Sharingan, but it certainly made sense. Itachi had built his own city inside the Manjikyu, and it was a wonder that he hadn't figured out the Hiraishin for himself. Which brought him to his next question. Couldn't someone barge their way in and stop him from using it? The great toad shook his head. Each formula is unique to a certain chakra signature, and the seal on the tattoo is nearly the same as the seal he places on his kunai. The difference is that there is an entrance and exit character. In simpler terms, the seal he places on other objects and people are the doors, and he himself is the only key that can open them. That actually makes sense. So do I have to make my own key and doors? That, or you could just modify Minato's slightly. Wait, but if it's unique to chakra signatures, then how would that work? Gamabunta paused, giving Naruto an incredulous look. You still don't know? Know what? He shook his large head again, a deep, rumbling sigh slipping out of his mouth. It's not my place to tell you. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this what if, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember, even shadow clones need love. Peace out, Shinobi.